Ladies and gentlemen, as we are about to begin, please be seated. Before we get started, we have some few announcements to make. First, I would like to seek your cooperation in completing the seminar. Next, as any one of you carrying a cell phone, please switch it off and turn it to silent mode to avoid interruptions. And if it is an urgent call, please exit the room first before taking the call. Thank you for your kind consideration and attention. Good afternoon, everyone. We would like to extend a very welcome to all of you. We appreciate your effort despite your busy schedule in joining us here today for the Professorial Chair Holder Lecture on Geopolitics and Public Administration. I am Mr. Omar Arman Lapas.
And I am Engineer Leia Evangelista, and we will be the moderator of today's activity.
All right. I am personally excited to hear more about geopolitics as it has a political and economic effect on us, Ma'am Leia. How about you, Ma'am Leia? What's your take on this?
Yes, sir. No, actually, the geopolitics, this seminar is very exciting now because as I know, that geopolitics, this is the study of influence of factors such as geography, economics, and demography on the politics. Actually, in contemporary discourse, this has also been employed as a loose synonym for international politics, Sir Omar.
Yes. All right. So before anything else, may I request everyone to be in spirit of prayer as we ask the guidance of the Almighty Creator to be followed by the singing of national anthem.
Sakali
Ma'am Leia.
All right. Welcome everyone to our activity today. To give his welcome remarks, I would like to call Dr. Antonio C. Umali, the Dean of College of Political Science and Public Administration. Sir.
Okay, thank you, Leia, and to our DPA students and everybody who made this very important activity happen. To our distinguished professorial chairholder, Professor Richard J. Heydarian, incoming research fellow at the National Chengchen University, Taiwan. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation through Dean Raul Roland Sebastian to be part of our 117th founding anniversary of our great university as we prepare for our Red Letter Day come October 1st. For the second time since July 15, we are privileged to have you as our esteemed lecturer. An accomplished journalist and academic, Professor Heydarian's recent publications include The Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt against elite democracy, and the Indo-Pacific, Trump, China, and the new struggle for global mastery. He has contributed to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and Foreign Affairs, among other publications, and is a recognized authority among scholars when it comes to geopolitics in the Asian region. In his May 12, 2021 Aspenia Online International Analysis and Commentary on Asia's New Battleground, the South China Sea, and the Future of Global Order, the South China Sea is given its strategic location, is a potential powder keg that will more likely trigger a global crisis situation due to ongoing tensions among world powers. The insecurities of international security has slowly become an imminent threat to regional and global peace, describing it as the maritime heartland of Asia due to its immense resource potential and also a major international trade route where around $5 trillion every year go through this vital sea lane, which heightens friction among global players seeking control over the South China Sea. This is according to our renowned scholar. In addition, Professor Heydarian regarded this regional flashpoint as the battleground of the US-China New Cold War rivalry in the international stage that unfortunately spells trouble to the rest of the world. The emergence of China as the regional superpower has prompted Asian neighbors like the Philippines to consider strengthening existing alliances, such as the ASEAN being one of its original members. We look forward to a very engaging and meaningful academic discourse this afternoon. Congratulations to all of us for being part of this very significant event. Let us continue to learn from one another and keep on asking the hard questions as we continue our efforts to provide answers to present global challenges. Welcome and a pleasant day to all. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that uplifting words, Dr. Umali. And now, to introduce our professorial lecturer this afternoon, may I call on the president of the DPA Society, Dr. Cecil Suerte Felipe. Ma'am?
Good afternoon. Okay, it's an honor for me to introduce to you today an accomplished and brilliant guest speaker for this webinar on the Professorial Chair for their lecture on geopolitics and public administration. Dr. Umali has given some overview of who is our speaker for today. He is an academic, opinion columnist, and a media pundit as well as policy advisor focusing on Asia Pacific region. As an academic, he is a political science professor at the Ateneo Manila University and De La Salle University. Most recently, he was a research fellow at the National Chengchi University in Taiwan. He has delivered numerous lectures and talks at the world's leading universities, including Columbia University, Stanford University, Harvard University, Johns Hopkins University, Leiden University, the the Australian National University, and the National University of Singapore. As an advisor, he has provided consultancy to top government officials, presidential candidates, civil society groups, as well as investment groups, including Deutsche Bank, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs. He is a regular opinion writer for Al Jazeera, The Straits Times, Nikkei Asian Review, South China Morning Post, Forbes, and a columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. He is currently a non-resident fellow at Strat-based ADR Institute, a resident political analyst for GMA Network, where he is also a co-host for the Stand for Truth show. As previously a resident foreign affairs analyst for the ABS-CBN news channel. He is a regular contributor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Council on Foreign Relations, and frequently contributes to other leading think tanks across the world. He was awarded as one of the 10 outstanding young men in the Philippines in 2016, as well as one of the 10 outstanding young persons of the world in 2018 for his contribution to social sciences and public education. As one of the most prominent strategic thinkers in the region, he authored several books, the latest of which is The Rise of Duterte, a Populist Revolt Against the Elite Democracy. He has written more than 1,000 articles and columns, including the interesting Duterte foreign policy. With all his works, he has been described by many respectable personalities as one of Asia's most prolific young analysts, also among the country's foremost and foreign affairs economic analysts, and most prolific and interviewed geopolitical analysts, currently writing and speaking not only in the Philippines, but arguably in the Southeast Asia as well. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now attentively listen and learn from our brilliant guest speaker, Mr. Richard Heydarian. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Ma'am Celia. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and Sir Antonius. For some reason, can I share? Okay. Can I share my video now? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. There have been some technical problems. Thank you very much again for this kind invitation. Yeah, I thought there was a problem with my Zoom. How many minutes do I have, Sir Raul, for the lecture proper?
You have 1 hour, 1.5 hours.
And then we have question and answer, right? Yeah. Afterwards. Until what time ba tayo?
5 p.m. 5 p.m.
5 p.m. Okay. All right. We got a lot of time. Okay. Just to be clear about that. So maraming salamat again. I suppose some of you folks already attended the previous lecture. So the previous lecture was really the big picture, no? The mega picture. And as I mentioned earlier, these professorial lectures are reflected in a forthcoming book with Melbourne University Press, no? The title is China's New Empire. But actually, it's not just about China, but it's more about the struggle for autonomy, strategic autonomy, and independence of smaller countries around China. So the book starts with Hong Kong and Taiwan, then goes to the Philippines, which is the longest chapter at around, I think, 20,000 words. I'm still trying to cut it down. And that will be reflected in our lecture today. And then, of course, I'll focus on the Malayan Peninsula, Singapore, and Malaysia, and what are their divergent approaches to deal with China. Then we go to Indonesia, the biggest country in the region and one of the most important, and how Indonesia is trying to balance its relations with China. Then we end in Vietnam. So that's the kind of kung may 9 dash na ng China, meron din akong parang ganun, no? Itong semi-circle of resistance. Then from there, I'll try to zoom out and look at how other powers, no? Australia, the Quad powers, the European countries, among others, in a separate chapter, are trying to push back against China's assertiveness. So it's a book as much about China's rising influence, but also the limits of China's influence and ability to dictate the strategic direction of neighboring countries. So China may be a large country because it's 1.3 billion people, but the Philippines is not a small country. We're more than 100 million people, 110 million. Indonesia is almost 300 million people. So actually, China is surrounded by emergent or actually potential middle powers. So Indonesia is already a middle power in its own right. So it's not a question of China just dictating its terms on a bunch of hapless, helpless, smaller countries. But for today, for the second lecture, I'll focus on the Philippines, and which I think is, of course, something which is very dear to us, and of course, in light of our elections soon. Can we go to the screen share? So just to give I'll go a little bit deep into history. So I'll be thanks to Raul, I'll be most likely teaching. I think we're sure about that. I'm going to be teaching a course on diplomatic history. So you're going to see a preview of that. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I'm going to preview the Philippines, a course on Philippine strategic history, essentially over the past 100 years. And I'm going to look at multiple important critical junctures kung saan the destiny of the Philippines could have perhaps been different, right? And we can ask a lot of what-if questions. So to understand President Duterte's foreign policy and what can come afterwards, we have to have a genealogical analysis. We have to go back deep into our history, at least 100 years ago, right? The first time when we tried to establish our own independent nation state. So we have to start with the Katipuneros, right? So I'll go a little bit back into history before reaching back to President Duterte and to see how we move forward. So let me just screen share. Okay. So the discussion today is at a crossroads, right? So we are indeed at the crossroads, like many countries around the region. Am I being sabotaged? Okay. Parang ayaw niya sorry. Anyways, okay. So we are at the crossroads, clearly. We are increasingly entering a post-American world. But my contention is that just because we're entering a post-American world doesn't mean that America will be irrelevant, nor does it mean that China will automatically dominate the world, right? I believe that the situation is much more complicated and much more contested than that. That has been at the heart of my writings through and through, and hopefully more to come. But before we go to President Duterte and Philippine foreign policy, we have to understand what kind of context President Duterte came into power. And also we have to understand perhaps the mindset of President Duterte. And some of the people are saying we need a revolution or an overhaul in our foreign policy. So if you look at the Philippines, first of all, we got our formal independence from the Americans, right, on the ashes of Second World War. So if you read the great book Rampage, right, it looks like it really shows you graphically what on earth happened to the Philippines in the Second Battle of Manila, because I'll discuss the First Battle of Manila in the late 19th century later on. But if you look at the Second Battle of Manila, many historians and analysts are saying that the Americans, in order to avoid casualties on their part, on the part of GIs, really resorted to a lot of carpet bombing. Well, in Japan, they used nuclear weapons. And in fact, there's a big debate whether the second nuclear drop, I think, was it in Nagasaki, was even necessary to begin with. But in the Philippines, we had a different version. And there, as the Americans tried to retake Manila, they really bombarded huge parts of Manila. My late friend Carlos Celdran, right, who really loved Manila and who really tried to promote and bring back the old Manila to our imagination. He talked about how that Battle of Manila really devastated the very heartland of our beautiful city. Remember, Manila and Philippines most broadly was supposed to be the Perlas del Oriente, right? I mean, we were supposed to be the pearl of the Orient. And Manila was one of the most glamorous and beautiful cities. I think if you go to places like Argentina and look at Buenos Aires, for instance, you can still see the remnants of their glory days from 100 years ago when Argentina was the 5th richest country. Now, had it not been for the Second Battle of Manila, perhaps we would have had something similar to Argentinians, right? Some beautiful parts of Manila to still go to and enjoy, way more than what we have right now in Intramuros, and kind of reflect on how we used to be really a great nation. And unfortunately, only a small part of the glory of Manila has been preserved and restored. But even that, of course, is extremely precious, and we have to stick to that. Now, if you look at the Philippines, so after the Battle of Manila, we were heavily devastated country. And it was also around that time that the Americans essentially said, here, your independence, and you're essentially on your own. Now, even if you disagree with that, I've heard some very senior officials within this administration and in the Philippine government in general who feel that the Americans essentially dumped the independence on us after heavily devastating parts of the Philippines, especially Manila, right? And I think there's also a sense that the Americans could have pressed the Japanese more to give us more reparation. In the end, what happened was when the Cold War came into being, it seems Japan was a greater priority for the United States than the Philippines, even though Japan was the former enemy and the Philippines was an ally through and through. And if you want to understand that, look at the unequal treaties we have with the United States, which we can discuss later on. If you look at the Mutual Defense Treaty of the Philippines and the US, it's a little bit wishy-washy on the automaticity of American assistance to us kung magkakaroon tayo ng giyera with the third party, let's say China. Now, if you look at the Japanese defense treaty with the Americans, it's much more straightforward. It's much more automatic. So the very text of the mutual defense treaties that we have with the Americans and the Japanese have with the Americans kind of also reflects the kind of prioritizations that the Americans had on the eve of the Cold War, where increasingly Japan was becoming more important than the Philippines to the Americans. So there's a sense that there was an element of strategic abandonment. But more than that, after the end of Second World War and the Philippines, of course, become independent by this point, the reality is that our political leaders throughout different administrations essentially outsourced our external security needs. So you can look at the Military Bases Agreement of 1947, the Military Assistance Pact of 1947, the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951, and later on, of course, we had the Visiting Forces Agreement and Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. If you look at a lot of these agreements, whether directly or indirectly, it seems a lot of our political leaders were much more interested in having Americans there to take care of our external security threats while they were doing whatever they were doing. And of course, the story of the Philippines' national security over the past half a century is domestic insurgencies. So if you look at the Philippines, we have been grappling with one of the longest running communist and Islamist insurgencies in the world, right? More than half a century, perhaps, of communist insurgencies alone. And if you look at the armed forces of the Philippines, there's a lot of army there. There's a lot of focus on ground warfare and insurgency. And that is not supposed to be the case for an archipelagic country like the Philippines. So our shorelines are, I think, as long as that of Russia, just to keep things in mind. And Russia has 11 time zones. We are one of the largest archipelagic nations, and yet the armed forces of the Philippines is mostly army focused. So our Navy, which is supposed to be at the forefront of our national security, deterrence capability, and our Air Force for a long time have been neglected. And only recently we're doing something about that. So just to give you some ideas behind it, because before we have to go to Duterte, we have to also understand the background. The background is extremely important. There's another important thing we have to keep in mind. Now, I remember, I think this is 2015, I saw a survey kung saan Filipinos' approval ratings of America's role in the world was higher than America's approval of their own role in the world, right? So that's where the idea that Filipinos are among the most pro-American people on earth comes into being. And of course, survey after survey, nakikita natin na the Americans and later and Australians and Japanese tend to be the most favored external partners for the Filipino people. Yes, that is true. And if you just look at that, then you're going to say, oh my goodness, how on earth did we get someone like Duterte who openly lashes out at this country? How on earth can Duterte get away with saying positive things about China? Diba China, net negative pa nga yung approval niya or yung trust rating niya sa mga SW survey. Well, that's just part of the story. The story is much more complicated. If you scratch the surface and look at some interesting data by the Pew survey, for instance, and if you look at also the data, for instance, by Pulse Asia, it's very interesting. For instance, the Pulse Asia survey back in 2017 showed that, this is Duterte's first year in office, that at least half of Filipinos were undecided, meaning part of them, at least half of Filipinos had doubts about how beneficial our alliance with the United States is. So around 33% were undecided and 17% disagreed that our alliance with the United States has been beneficial to us. So what I'm trying to say here is this. It is true that Filipinos like Americans. I mean, there's no question about that. It's one of the most American-friendly countries perhaps on earth, along with Israel, Kenya, South Korea, and some of the other countries. But when people are asked, can you rely on the Americans? Have they been beneficial to us? There nakita natin na medyo hindi, medyo alanganin ng mga tao. No? So 33% were undecided, 17% in fact disagreed, right? So this is where you can see bakit yung rhetoric ni Pangulong Duterte coming into power that mga Americans, are you with us? That's what he said after his meeting with Ambassador Goldberg, no, in 2016. Sabi niya, tinanong ko si Goldberg, are you with us? You see, that kind of rhetoric really appeals to a large number of Filipinos. Now, we can argue whether this is the Duterte effect or this has been lingering there for quite some time. I think it's a combination of two. It's a combination of both elements. I think President Duterte has been very convincing when it comes to sowing doubts or reinforcing lingering doubts about the beneficiality of our alliance with the United States. Andyan ba sila para sa atin when push comes to shove? No? And again, if we look at the text of the Mutual Defense Treaty, depending on how you interpret it, you can argue it either way. No? So there are certain ambiguities there. It's also interesting to keep in mind that there was a Pew survey not long after, which showed that there's also a closing gap between the US and China in terms of their favorability among Filipinos, including, especially under the Trump presidency, because Trump was quite an unpopular guy around the world, except not that much in Vietnam and the Philippines. Still, he got quite high approval rating. But still, what is interesting is this. So from 2015, this is the last years of the Aquino years, no, to 2017, the first year, second year of President Duterte, a growing number of Filipinos actually, so you have a double-digit increase, more than 20% increase in the number of Filipinos saying that it's better to engage with China economically than confront China. That number was almost the reverse. So more people back in the Aquino days were saying that we have to stand up to China rather than economically engage them. Under President Duterte, it seems, so that's why I'm saying maybe President Duterte's rhetoric is also having some resonance, or it used to have resonance. President Duterte was quite effective in convincing people that, well, since the Americans are not the most reliable ally and we don't know whether they're with us or not, maybe it makes sense that we focus on economically engaging with China rather than confronting them militarily. No? So I think these are very important things that we have to keep in mind when we try to understand President Duterte's foreign policy. Because I think there's a lot of shallow analysis out there that, well, you know, President Duterte is a pro-China guy in a very pro-American country. That barely scratches the surface. Because if you look at these numbers, it clearly shows you that large numbers of Filipinos are a little bit unclear and unsure about whether our alliance with the United States is beneficial to us or whether the Americans are helpful. And therefore, pragmatically, they have been saying maybe it's better that we try to have a more conciliatory approach to China rather than a more confrontational approach. I argue that this is precisely the reason why President Duterte did not still suffer significant decreases in his approval or favorability rating throughout the years, despite the fact that many Filipinos want us to have a tougher stance in the South China Sea, despite the fact that many Filipinos may not be comfortable with President Duterte's open flirtation with China, you know, all of this almost slavish rhetoric that he has towards China. It's precisely because of this pragmatic calculus that has been captured by the surveys. I think this is a very important thing. This is an important set of data that we have to keep in mind before we go into our analysis. Now, again, let us have a kind of a lingerie, not lingerie, but lingerie, no, long structural, long-term structural longitudinal analysis. Now, if you look at the Philippine history, over the past century or so, we have been at least 5 critical strategic junctures. No, kung saan, depending on the decisions of our leaders and certain policies of our leaders and how we deal with superpowers, the trajectory of our foreign policy and perhaps even national development would have been different or could have been different. So there are lots of what ifs that this situation raised. And that's where I'm going to give a preview of the course that, God willing, we'll be teaching soon on Philippines diplomatic history. So I think Sir Raul can look at it, and the syllabus will come soon, right? In the readings and all. So there are 5 important junctures. The first one was the Battle of Manila, 1898. I'll discuss that very shortly, when some people would argue that we had a good chance of occupying Manila and beating the Spanish through and through on our own without the Americans. So back in 1898, right, there was an ill-fated alliance or defection to Americans against the Spanish, and we paid the price for that. I'll discuss that later on a bit more. The second strategic juncture was under President Manuel Quezon, right, during the Commonwealth era. And this is where the Philippines was trying to win its independence while nervously watching the rise of Imperial Japan. And just when the Americans were also worried that if we get our independence, it will not last too long, because the Imperial Japanese will easily conquer us the same way that they tried to conquer Manchuria. Of course, they did it successfully in large parts of China later on, and much earlier, Taiwan, just north of us, and the Korean Peninsula, right? And then the third important strategic juncture, we'll have a little bit of Imelda shuttle diplomacy here. I don't know if you have watched the Kingsmaker documentary. You really have to watch that. There's a part when Imelda says, "I ended the Cold War." And I think it was based on a meeting she had with Chairman Mao. And from my fellow Ilocano friends, no, they have been chismising to me throughout the years. Sabi nila, pag nagsispeech daw si Imelda dyan in North, I think Batak or some of the cities in the North, she always recites when she met Chairman Mao. You know, she always says that. So one of her favorite stories is when she met Chairman Mao. But of course, Imelda met many, many big important people, which she loves to flaunt, right? Whoever comes to interview her or comes to her place, no? You know, her meeting with Gaddafi of Libya, asking the help of the Libyans in dealing with the MNLF, and later on, of course, the MILF also issue in the Philippines, but back then MNLF issue. Of course, she met, you know, the Kennedys, I think, of course, the Reagans, the Nixons. So, you know, all these global politicians, she met them, right? So she was our kind of a de facto foreign minister, perhaps, in certain ways, or part of a shuttle diplomacy. So we'll discuss that later on. The fourth one was, this is the era of karaoke diplomacy, right? And to be honest, I believe Ramos got it best when it comes to our foreign policy compared to everyone else. The bar could be low, but I believe Ramos got it most right, or least wrong, among all our presidents. So he tried to conciliate the Chinese through karaoke diplomacy with Jiang Zemin. At the same time, once the mischief-free crisis became pretty crystal clear, he tried to leverage our ASEAN linkages. He tried to leverage our relationship with the United States and try to bring them back in one form or the other to deter the Chinese. There was a realization that the withdrawal of Americans was not perhaps the best thing for the country if you're not prepared to stand on your own. And of course, there was also the first attempt at modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines, which started under Ramos in the post-Marcos era, right? And lastly, this is where we're going to discuss Duterte in the post-American world and the strategic crossroads that we're in. So let's quickly go through them. So again, just to warn you, I'm not going to go in depth into each of these strategic junctures. You're free to sign up to our course soon, God willing, later this year. So I'm going to go deeper into these topics. But let me just give an overview of these important strategic junctures in Philippine history. By the way, I'm not a historian by training. I'm a political scientist by training. So I'm approaching this as a political scientist, just to be clear. I mean, our historian friends can go and bash me and say, oh, but you got this detail, whatever. So I'm not going to pretend I'm a historian. I'm approaching this as a political scientist. Now, if you look at it, in the late 19th century, I'll try to really narrow this down. I mean, this is where the whole controversy of Rizal and Bonifacio and all of that comes in the picture. Now, the Rizalian argument was, yes, we want to be an independent country, but we have to do it under the right circumstances, right? Because if we just have a premature revolution, wala, mamamatay lang tayo dyan, lalong mawawala ng ano, 'di ba? Ganang tao, 'di ba? So we have to strike at the right moment, no? And that's why Rizal disagreed, no? When the Bonifacio people tried to send him an emissary and tried to sign him up for the emerging Katipunero revolution, right? Because from Rizal's point of view, the Philippines was not ready yet. In fairness to Rizal, though, he seems to have not been aware of certain major developments, or he may not have been very much aware of the degree to which the Spanish Empire was increasingly bogged down in Cuba. So wag natin kalimutan, the Philippines Katipunan Revolution coincided also with the Spanish-American War, no? And the Spanish sent huge numbers of troops across the Atlantic to stamp out the Cuban revolutionary movement, no? So Bonifacio's calculation was, and you can say somehow correct, was that the Spanish will have a hard time fighting on two fronts. At the same time, for people who are familiar with Madrid's politics back then, Madrid was also in a desperate mode. They already lost large parts of their colonies in Latin America, starting with the Bolivarian Revolution in the early 19th century. So the Philippines, the heartland of the Spanish East Indies, and Cuba, their kind of jewel in the Caribbean, they wanted to hold on to that, no? Kasi Spain was almost becoming a peripheral force, and it was a matter of pride. Kaya very brutal yung tactics na ginamit ng mga Spanish, especially in Cuba, no, to deal with the independence movement. Now, of course, the Americans get involved in Cuba eventually. We don't have time to go to the circumstances of how the Americans got involved, but obviously the Americans were sensing their own opportunity. I think what a lot of our Katipuneros perhaps were not aware of, including Rizal, was the Americans also had their own imperial designs. No, so there was the so-called Mahan Doctrine, and Theodore Roosevelt, in many ways, was pushing for the operationalization of that Mahanian doctrine. And if you look at the Alfred Thayer Mahan's idea, for him, the Americans have to dominate their adjacent waters, right? The same way that the Romans were able to dominate their adjacent waters. So if the Romans turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake, the Americans have to also dominate the Caribbean and all. And Mahan's idea was that for you to be a major power, similar to the British and previously to the Dutch and the Spanish and Portuguese, you have to have powerful naval forces. So in the late 19th century, the Americans, which were already emerging as the world's leading industrial and economic power, were beginning to invest also in their naval power. And they were also beginning to be more assertive in operationalizing their hegemonic ambitions in the Americas. No, so starting with the Caribbean and Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, increasingly the Americans were stretching their tentacles across the Pacific. At the same time, I think Carlos P. Romulo, among others, also wrote on this back in the days when I think Romulo was still a journalist. Very interesting article in Foreign Affairs magazine on this issue back in the days. Well, the Americans were also getting involved in the scramble in Asia for Chinese markets. So the Chinese are angry about one thing a lot, no, and that is the so-called 100 years of humiliation. This is the Opium War era. This is an era where every major and not so major European power had an outpost across port cities in China. Of course, Hong Kong would be developed by the British, but even the Germans, the Italians, the Russians, all of them were coming in. The Japanese would also come in. So the Americans wanted also a piece of action. So based on that calculus, and also this Mahanian doctrine of building strong naval capacities, the Americans were slowly moving into Asia, and eventually the Philippines will become their only Asian colony, although they never openly admitted that they're a colonial power, but that's effectively what they became. And by occupying the Philippines, they would be in a good position, right, to have an influence and have a piece of action when it comes to the Chinese markets, the very prized Chinese markets. That's why the Philippines has been seen as a very important hub or entrepot. And let's not forget, the Philippines was also at the center of the galleon trade, during the Spanish Imperium, So the trade from New Mexico in North America with China, a lot of that went through us. So we were kind of like a Singapore, right? And the Americans wanted to have a piece of action, and therefore the Americans had imperial designs, despite all of their, pretensions to being different from those Europeans and being different from those empires in Europe and in this from the so-called old world. No, I think our Katipuneros were not very much appreciative of these debates and this increasingly imperial turn in American foreign policy, especially in light of the influence of Alfred Thayer Mahan, and more importantly, the role of Theodore Roosevelt, who was first a major official in the U.S. Navy before later on, of course, become the President of America, in the early 20th century. So this is the context. So our Katipuneros were so focused on beating the Spanish that they saw the Americans as some sort of a natural, reliable ally. And we know from history that Emilio Aguinaldo, when he was in exile, after cutting some temporary deal with the Spanish, he actually went and met an American, an American diplomat. If I'm not mistaken, this is in Singapore, right? And the sense that Aguinaldo got from that meeting, along with some other Katipuneros and all, was that we can rely on the Americans to help us against the Spanish. And I think his understanding was that the Americans will help us and to, once we defeat the Spanish, to essentially be their allies, but essentially be in control of our own country. So that was, I think, a very naive move on the part of our Katipuneros, and I think it would have served them better if they learned more English and they were more involved. They were more in tune with the internal debates and internal developments in American foreign policy. Beginning, of course, with this American intervention in Cuba, among other things. So there was a degree of naivety there, that we can use the Americans to assert our national sovereignty, or in this case, to kick out the Spanish, right, and create our own nation. And this is not the end of the tragedy itself. If you look at Nick Joaquin, I mean, he has this great book, A Question of Heroes, when he profiles 10 of our leading figures behind the establishment of the Filipino nation. And in the chapter on Aguinaldo, it's really a fascinating chapter. Actually, I think two parts yung kay Aguinaldo niya eh. So very extensive yung analysis niya kay Aguinaldo. This is something that I think we don't discuss much in our own national discourse and all. Actually, if you look at it, we were beating the Spanish on our own. The American assistance was not as consequential or even significant. So as Nick Joaquin put it, the breathtaking thing about this is that Aguinaldo had done it on his own. Obviously not on his own per se, but we had a lot of ilustrado, engineering background people. I think we had some of you folks are engineers, right? Who went to the Europe and learned cutting edge engineering technology, including in trench warfare, tactics, among other things. And so our Katipuneros were able to beat the hell out of the Spanish right and left, and the Spanish were really on their knees. And the argument there is that had Aguinaldo been a little bit less naive about Americans, and had Aguinaldo and our Katipuneros been a little bit more aggressive about taking Manila on their own after quite comprehensively defeating the Spanish forces here in the Philippines, especially in the Luzon area, we would not have ended up as an American colony. Because if you look at Admiral George Dewey, he essentially kept to the bay, with his land troops. So there were hours, if not days, critical hours and days when we could have taken Manila ourselves or cut a deal directly with the beaten Spanish ourselves. But that's not what we did. So what happened there is Nick Joaquin quite politically incorrectly calls that native timorousness on the part of Aguinaldo. He called him a small man with little imagination. And for him, for Aguinaldo not taking that initiative, not waiting for Americans to take the initiative and enter the city ahead of us and occupying and dominating the city, that lost us a major historic opportunity to reclaim Manila and establish an independent Philippines without much American interference, or perhaps we could have even avoided colonization by America. Again, we're going to go deep into history, but I'm not going to go deep into that because we don't have time for that. But the idea here is that there are two lessons we can get here. One lesson is that be careful who you ally with, in order to push your own interests. In fact, if our Katipuneros read a little bit more of Niccolo Machiavelli, right, they would have also learned a thing or two about the dangers and perils of alliance with America against the Spanish, because Niccolo Machiavelli warned Italian city-states, the smallest city-states, like, be very careful if you want to play the bigger kingdoms, the Spanish and the French, against each other, because you might end up as the prize itself, right? And that's exactly what happened in the case of the Philippines. We underestimated the imperial designs of the Americans. And on a tactical level, according to Nick Joaquin, the native timorousness of Aguinaldo prevented him also from gaining the strategic high ground and placing us in a good position if ever the Americans wanted to force their will on us. But we didn't take that. So we had some naivety about the alliances that we were building. And in the end, exactly as Machiavelli warned, we ended up as the prize, right? The Spanish eventually cut a deal with the Americans, who took the initiative, during the Battle of Manila. And essentially, the Spanish sold the Philippines to the Americans without much knowledge of our Katipuneros. And eventually, we realized that, oops, voila, we have been duped, We have been duped. And that was a very tragic moment in Philippine history. Now, we can go on and debate. I mean, there are lots of debate about General Luna. Had General Luna, I mean, this was not the last opportunity for us to establish an independent Philippines. Had General Luna, for instance, if he had more support from Aguinaldo, and if he was given the opportunity to go with his own strategy, including focusing with kind of a guerrilla warfare from my hometown or in the Baguio Cordillera region, who knows? Maybe we could still have defeated the Americans. This is not about defeating Americans on a conventional basis. This was about exhausting Americans and raising the cost of war so much that the isolationists, right, the anti-colonial voices in America would have been able to defeat the more colonialist, imperialist voices in America in the early 20th century and late 19th century. That was the game. And we have seen, from Afghanistan in the case of Taliban to Viet Cong in the case of South Vietnam, it's not about conventionally defeating Americans. It's about, it's about being the poisoned shrimp, to use the term of Lee Kuan Yew. If you can inflict significant damage, then you can strengthen the anti-colonial voices in the emerging empire. And in this case, it was America. Now, we can also debate about General Luna. Like, what if General Luna was successful? Would he have been able to conquer entire Philippines? Or baka Republic of Luzon lang tayo? And what kind of regime would it have been? Would it have been an authoritarian regime? Would it have been more similar to Sukarno's regime, for instance? Let's see. There's a lot of debate on that, And if you look at the essay by Ninoy Aquino in Foreign Affairs magazine in the 1960s, he had some interesting points to make. I may not agree with it or not, but he cited some of the Filipino politicians and diplomats who said, well, maybe it was better that we were conquered by Americans, because if otherwise, we could have had two other nightmare scenario. We would have been ruled by our own tyrants, right? And we would have ended something more like some of our more authoritarian neighbors. Or second, the Philippines could have been efficient in resisting the Americans, but the Germans and the British could have later on come and taken care of us, not to mention the Japanese, of course. So there's a lot of what ifs that we can discuss, but that goes beyond the parameters of our discussions for today. I'm just giving you a flavor of this very interesting critical junctures that we had in Philippine history, these lost opportunities and the false allies. The second critical juncture happened under Manuel Quezon. So as you know, Manuel Quezon, of course, he was involved in the Katipunero fight against the Americans, but later on, of course, he becomes our Commonwealth president. I think Manuel Quezon, he was the first guy who could have been one of the big men of Asia. So I mean, if the Indians have Nero, and Singaporeans have Lee Kuan Yew, and Indonesia had Sukarno, Manuel Quezon was kind of positioning himself as that in the case of the Philippines. And he had a lot of authoritarian tendencies, and a lot of dirty tricks were used also during the elections back in the Commonwealth days. Nonetheless, he was also a very savvy politician, right? Nonetheless, he had a big problem. So he wanted the Philippines to be as independent as possible. So from the Jones Act to the Tidings-McDuffie Act, so on and so forth, there was a lot of lobbying happening in the case of the Philippines in the U.S. Congress. And as far as Manuel Quezon was concerned, he tried to make sure that if ever we were going to get an independence, he will get the credit for that. And he would be in a position to dominate the Philippines. once we have the independence. So this was really his personal ambition, his driving. This was a driving force of his career. No, now, but he had one big problem. The big problem was the rise of Imperial Japan. So Imperial Japan is also a very tragic story. So if you look at it, for a very long time, Tokyo was kind of like the hub for revolutionary nationalist movement. It was a hub for political exiles and nationalists from across the region. So whether Chinese nationalists, right, who were against a corrupt and crumbling Qing dynasty and wanted to kick out the European powers who were chipping out, who were chewing at every margins of the Chinese empire, or some Katipuneros, some of them ended up in Japan, and also, emergent nationalist leaders from all other parts of the world. No, at some point, Japan was the hub for Asian nationalism, and especially after Japan's defeat of the Russians, in the 1905, if I'm not mistaken, Japan became a hero for a lot of Asians. So from Cairo to Istanbul to Mumbai, to Manila, to China, a lot of people are cheering for Japan, and they were very proud to see an Asian country defeating a Western country for that matter. Although Russia is not necessarily a Western country, but this was a moment of pride. Nonetheless, unfortunately, what happened was increasingly Japan would tilt towards a more imperialistic and aggressive direction in its foreign policy, and there are many explanations for that. But one interesting explanation I saw was the fact that Japan felt they were not respected, welcome, and dignified by their allies following their victory in the First World War. So let's not forget, Japan used to be an ally of Britain, right? So the Japanese was hoping that during the Versailles conference and after the conclusion of First World War, they would be more respected as a partner of the West, including the British, the French, and the Americans. But a lot of discriminatory policies would emerge in the West, including in America, against Japanese Americans or people of Japanese descent. And then there were also very disparaging comments that the French Prime Minister made against the Japanese, racist comments the French Prime Minister made against the Japanese during the Versailles Conference. So next snowball yan, no? So there were many factors that came together and convinced the Japanese that they're never going to be accepted by the West as an equal. And this also strengthened the voice of more hardliner militaristic elements in Japan. And as you know, Japanese politics will also turn very violent. There'll be assassination attempts against prime ministers, and increasingly the hawks will take over the Japanese foreign policy. Now, Quezon had a lot of dealings with the Japanese and with the Americans at the same time. So he was kind of trying to balance with the Japanese and Americans. And Goodman has a very interesting article on this, whereby, at points he accuses or alleges that Quezon, because of his domestic interest in gaining independence for the Philippines and dominating that Philippines, or becoming a dominant figure in the Philippines, he repeatedly poo-pooed any Japanese threat to the islands, in order to encourage Americans to give the Philippines independence. Because his fear was that, that the Americans, even if the more, let's say, isolationist, anti-colonial voices in America prevail and give the Philippines independence, they may have second thoughts about that if they feel that the Japanese would come and just dominate the Philippines and colonize the Philippines like they did in neighboring Taiwan and Korea, and later on across China. So Quezon, while he was not totally naive, unfortunately, he had kind of a conflict of interest. I mean, this is what we get from some of the sources, whereby he kept on contradicting himself. He tried to play both sides. In the meantime, the Japanese were trying to play him, because the Japanese also knew that he had an interest in playing down the threat from them. The Americans had their doubts with Quezon. No, and in the end, this ended in a tragedy. No, if you look at it, in the end, the Philippines and the Americans were not ready for the Japanese invasion. So when the Japanese invasion happened, I mean, why should MacArthur said, "I shall return"? He should say, "I shall return," because they had no preparation, and the Japanese just came in and bombed the hell out of our Air Force and our military barracks and all of that. There was hardly any resistance when the Japanese first invaded the Philippines on the eve of the Second World War. So that shows that there was tremendous amount of naivety or lack of preparation on the part of the Philippines and including the Americans. And Quezon, I mean, we're not here to blame Manuel Quezon, But Quezon, unfortunately, had some sort of conflict of interest. And at times, perhaps even though he had his own second thoughts about the Japanese, he had an interest, personal political interest, no, in playing down that legitimate threat from Japan in order to convince the Americans to give us an independence. Again, if you look at it, the reason I'm discussing these parts of history is because you can see echoes of that in today's, in our era, right? Not exactly on a one-to-one correspondence, but you can say that many dilemmas that Aguinaldo and Quezon felt, no? And you know how domestic political interest, domestic politics shapes also foreign policy, how our leaders try to play different powers against each other for our national interest or for their personal interest. Again, we see a lot of echoes of that in our era. But third, let's go. The third important critical juncture happens at the height of the Cold War. So we're talking about the 1970s when major developments happen. Now, these pictures are very interesting because here you see Bongbong Marcos, who could potentially become one of the top contenders for elections. I don't know. I'm not following news now for my announcement or anything like that. Sabi niya, baby daw sila. But you know, here you can see the baby is actually accompanying the mother for a very high level, it seems, no? Very high level diplomatic mission. And as Imelda said, she ended the Cold War. Now, because of her meeting, and you could see how Chairman Mao was really dazzled by, you know, and by Imelda's charms. No, now here, sorry about it. If can I? Okay, so here, very interesting. What we see is, you know, Marcos. Whew, the 70s were really crazy times. No, the 70s were really crazy times. Because in the 60s you had the Sino-Soviet split. So the Chinese and the Russians were supposed to be on one side, part of the Second World, the communist bloc. But after the death of Stalin, no, and with Khrushchev coming in and lambasting Stalin and all, Mao Zedong felt there's an opening. There's an opening to assert Chinese leadership within the communist bloc at the expense of the Russians, right? And there were also some genuine ideological differences between the much more hardline Mao and much more softened communism in the post-Stalin era, especially under Khrushchev, right? Because Khrushchev had to oversee some reforms and deal with some of the excesses of the Stalin era. So you have the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s, no? And in fact, you had some deadly border clashes between the two communist blocs in the mid-1960s. At some time, the Chinese, you know, felt that they had to go for nuclear weapons. And at one point, Mao supposedly said that, you know, should it come to war and the Russians use nuclear weapons, well, they have hundreds of millions of people to sacrifice just in case. In short, like there's so many Chinese, the Russians cannot beat us even if they have nuclear weapons. But eventually, the Chinese will develop their nuclear weapons also, you know, to gain some sort of parity with the Russians. So the relationship with the Soviet Union was really, really touchy in the 1960s. So the Americans sensed an opening there, no? So they took advantage of the Sino-Soviet split. So Nixon and Kissinger oversaw a detente with Mao in order to create a de facto alliance against the Soviets, right? So Soviets in Southeast Asia were also playing their game. They had an ally in Vietnam, and Vietnam wanted to also not only, well, I'm talking about North Vietnam first. And of course, North Vietnam didn't want to only take care of South Vietnam and occupy that, but it wanted to also establish a kind of a communist bloc in Indochina under Hanoi's own tutelage. No? So this was a very messy situation. So much of archipelagic Southeast Asia and the founding members of the ASEAN, most of them, if not all of them, were aligned with the US in one way or another, and all of them were scared of the communist bloc, especially the Soviets. No? So Marcos was in charge of the Philippines, and the martial law years particularly were really strategically messy, confusing, and very delicate moments. No? So Marcos had to navigate this Sino-Soviet split, and at the same time, the Sino-American detente. No, so a lot of moving parts here. Not to mention, you also have, at least this is the argument of Singapore and some of the countries in ASEAN, an expansionist Vietnam. No, and the Philippines, of course, was involved in one way or another because, as an American ally, we provided logistical and sometimes even troops, no, for logistical support and also troops, no, for America's wars in this part of the world against the communist bloc, from the Korean War to the Vietnam War. So Marcos was facing a very, very tricky situation. And at home, of course, you also have the rise of communist progressive movements in the Philippines. And later on, of course, you also have the rise of the Moro insurgencies. So Marcos tried to really shrewdly, to navigate this very difficult process, and he tried to establish communication channels with all the three major powers. So we normalize our relations with Maoist China at the expense of Taiwan. So we adopted a one China policy. We're among the first countries in the world and first U.S. allies to normalize relations with China in the 70s. And then that's where you see the Imelda going to Mao Zedong and all of that. At the same time, Marcos also tried to use multifarious networks of proxies, including former communist rebels in the Philippines, to also keep some communication channels with the Soviets, right? And let's not forget, our own communist leftist movement was also divided between those who were more sympathetic to Moscow and those who were more sympathetic to Maoist version of communism and Beijing. So Marcos tried to play all sides, and at the same time, of course, he was also a U.S. ally. And he tried to use the Sino-Soviet split, the Indochina Wars, among others, to also extract more concessions from Americans. So while many people will try to portray Marcos as kind of a puppet of the United States, the reality is that in many cases, Marcos actually tried to gain more strategic rents from the American, and there were some hard bargaining and negotiations. So it's not totally fair to say Marcos was just an American puppet, because that guy was also shrewd when it comes to his strategy. Now, of course, we have huge issues with martial law, with his human rights record. We have huge problems with the economic strategy of Marcos. It was eventually was disaster by 1980s, 1982, 1983. The Philippines economy essentially collapsed. This is not a lecture about that. This is a lecture about foreign policy and strategy. And I think Marcos was not really didn't do actually too bad. He quite deftly navigated this very difficult strategic fault lines, this Sino-Soviet American rivalry in Southeast Asia. The other interesting thing that happened under the Marcos administration, again, this is not endorsement of the martial law or the Marcos era, but to be fair, it was also in the 1970s under Marcos that the Philippines recognized that the South China Sea could be a very hotly disputed area. He also recognized na maraming resources siya, na maging mahalaga itong area, itong region na yan, at dapat i-assert natin yung parts of the South China Sea, particularly yung Calayan group of islands, bilang isang bahagi ng ating teritorya. So it was really under Marcos that there were both legal, executive on one hand, but at the same time, you also had concrete military efforts to assert our claims over this island. So the Philippines, just to give you an example, was arguably the first country to establish a modern airstrip in the South China Sea, in the disputed islands. I mean, these are not even islands, they're islets, or some of them are just rocks and low tide elevations. We were among the first country to establish a modern airstrip there, yung sa Pagasa. This was done during the Marcos era, right? So whatever you want to say about the domestic politics during that time, so be it. But in terms of forward-looking vision, in terms of asserting our position on the ground, in terms of taking the strategic initiative, in fairness, the Marcos administration didn't do too bad when it comes to the South China Sea disputes. But of course, later on, ginaya tayo ng ibang bansa. Vietnam, the Chinese, everyone tried to copy us. And now China has this huge bases that dwarf whatever we built back in the 1970s and whatever upgraded version of that we're trying to have more recently. So these are the things that we have to keep in mind. And this was the third important critical juncture. And in fairness, in this case, the Philippines didn't do too bad in terms of navigating different fault lines. The fourth important juncture happens after the withdrawal of American bases from the Philippines. So pag nung nag-collapse ng Marcos dictatorship, what essentially happened here is that there was an upsurge of nationalist movement. Then, of course, a few years later, 3 years later, you have the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then by 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. So maraming nagsasabi dito na, why should we be hosting American troops? That's just an invitation for trouble. Others would argue, why do we even need to have American troops here? Because the Subic and Clark were the largest overseas American bases in the world. Now, why do we have to have thousands and tens of thousands of American troops on our soil? This is a humiliation to us. This undermines our sovereignty. The Soviet Union, anyways, is collapsing. And if and earlier, before the collapse of Soviet, some would say, well, just the presence of the Americans was not good for us. No, it would invite trouble. So there was this upsurge of nationalist movement, and the Philippine Senate, of course, eventually voted to get rid of the American bases, and the Cory Aquino's efforts to negotiate with Americans a better deal or keep them staying really didn't work. No, and then of course we had an earthquake before the withdrawal of Americans. So I think even financially and logistically, the Americans also calculated it's not worth it to maintain expensive bases in the Philippines. So they withdrew by 1992. Now, okay, you cannot agree with that and say, okay, this is it. End of Cold War, decades of dependence on America. So this is time for us to assert ourselves. Ang problema, mukhang hindi tayo handa, especially hindi tayo handa for China. So immediately what happened under China, no, is that few years after the withdrawal of the Americans, the Chinese made a move. No, so in the 70s and 80s, much of the aggressive Chinese moves in the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea area was really against Vietnam. First against South Vietnam when China got to occupy the Paracel Islands completely, and then later on against North Vietnam or Unified Vietnam. So in 1988, no, as the Soviet Union we began to withdraw from Afghanistan and to send mixed signals about its own mutual defense treaty with Vietnam, the Chinese sensed an opportunity. So you had the battle of you had very bloody skirmishes between the Vietnamese and the Chinese in the South China Sea. But the Philippines, we were broadly unscathed throughout this period, even if the Nixon administration, no, was a little bit wishy-washy about how much they want to be helpful to us should there be disputes between the Philippines and other claimant states. In fact, just to tell you this, during the Marcos era, the fear of the Americans was the Philippines would be the little bully there, right? Try to leverage our alliance with the United States and then bully the Malaysians and others and try to get other disputed land features in this practice. That's how aggressive the Philippines was back in the day. You know? And up until 1970s, the Philippines actually, our armed forces was among the best. Except all these decades of insurgencies, partly thanks to Marcos himself, really corroded our military capability over time. And we're paying a price for that, of course. But early on, actually, the fear of the Americans was that tayo maging bully. You know? So let's send the right signal to the Filipinos that, hey, if you want to use our alliance to drag us into your own war and bully other countries, you cannot rely on us. We don't want that, right? So that's why Kissinger and Nixon really had to make a series of statements and policy recommendations and revisions to kind of send a clear signal to the Philippines that we don't want to be dragged into your own, territorial aggrandizement ambitions. So this was the position of the Americans in the 1970s. Now, nonetheless, when the Marcos dictatorship falls and then the Soviet Union collapses and the American bases withdraw from the Philippines, the Chinese sense an opening now against the Philippines. Now they see a country that is still paying the price for decades of political instability and economic crisis. A lot of that under the Marcos dictatorship. No, so while Marcos did some good things in the South China Sea, the reality is that the Philippines that he left by 1986 was really a degraded country on so many fronts, militarily, economically, and more than that. And of course, Cory Aquino had to deal with half a dozen coups during her 6 years in office. So Ramos, when he came to power in 1992, despite his best efforts to revive the Philippine economy, which was quite successful, his best efforts to deepen our democracy, which was quite successful in the sense that he kept the military out of politics, the whole coup d'etats and all stopped. The reality was that the Philippines was still not fully prepared to stand on its own, especially in light of an increasingly assertive China. So by 1993, 1994, the Chinese were already making a move. And by 1995, well, partly because siguro lack of our surveillance capacity and all, lack of our maritime domain awareness capacity, we got to know the Chinese got the mischief reef. No? So their PLA soldiers and all were supposedly establishing some rudimentary structures there to help them to deal with storm or whatever. I mean, ganun naman yung style ng China always. When they build structures, they say, oh, this is for humanitarian purposes. It's for our innocent fishermen, or it's for some weather forecast station, whatever. So they try to pull that shenanigan with us. Now, Ramos, in fairness to him, tried to respond. No, so we tried to scramble our fighter jets. We sent some very strong messages diplomatically. But the problem was that the Americans, which were still smarting from their unceremonious exit from the Philippines, were in no mood to really help us. And to be honest, going back to this period, this is Clinton era. I cannot help but be very disappointed with the Americans. I don't know if they were petty, or whether they were really, an unreliable ally. I mean, there's many ways to discuss this, but you see, 1995, 1996, you had the third Taiwan Straits crisis, and the Americans sent 2 aircraft carriers, to stand in solidarity with the Taiwanese, so that the Chinese will not, use their artillery shells or even more aggressive amphibious maneuvers against Taiwan, right? But in the same time, around the same time in 1995, we already had this showdown with the Chinese. But what did the Clinton administration do? Their position was that we are neutral, wala kaming ano dyan, wala kaming, we have no stake there, we have no interest there. So the Americans essentially left us on our own. So Ramos was in a very, very tough position. So that's why he used a kind of a bifurcated approach. So on one hand, he tried to engage the Chinese. So you have this karaoke diplomacy with Jiang Zemin trying to charm each other. But at the same time, Ramos tried to bring back the Americans in one way or another, not in terms of permanent basis, because that would be illegal by that time, but in terms of at least increasing America's rotational military presence across Philippine territories and waters. And that's where the Visiting Forces Agreement comes into being. He also pushed for the Philippine Modernization Act because he realized napaka-degraded yung armed forces natin after decades of war in Mindanao and against communist insurgencies. But the reality is that, it will take time, before modernization of a degraded military will take effect. So I think Ramos was under no illusions that he can overnight suddenly make the Philippines more powerful and be able to stand up on its own and push back against China, an increasingly assertive China. Also, in fairness to Ramos, he also reached out to the ASEAN. So by the late 1990s, we already saw the outlines of what we call today a code of conduct. So hanggang ngayon, hindi pa tapos yung code of conduct negotiations with China. We know why, and we can discuss it later on. But under Ramos, there was a push, to come up with a legally binding code of conduct, and this effort was continued by the succeeding administration until Arroyo, and this culminated in the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea with China. And by the way, the DOC was supposed to be just a preliminary step before a fully legally binding code of conduct to make sure na hindi mangyayari yung mga shenanigans katulad nangyari sa Mischief Reef. So in fairness to Ramos, he was moving on multiple fronts, try to engage the Chinese and bring down the tensions and charm them and be charmed. But at the same time, he was naive. He tried to bring back the Americans through the Visiting Forces Agreement because he realized that yes, we have an AFP Modernization Act, but it's going to take some time before we develop the requisite capabilities. And he also tried to use multilateralism through ASEAN. And I think this was probably one of the smartest moves by any Filipino president when kind of squeezed between competing powers. So, and in this case, a completely unreliable America under the Clinton administration, which didn't want to help us in Mischief Reef, specifically, and increasingly aggressive China, which was sensing opportunity, right? Like a shark sensing, blood, it was coming in, and it saw that it can actually now also gnaw, and chip away at some of the Philippine claimed land features in the area. And let's not forget, the Mischief Reef is a low tide elevation, and it's within the Philippines continental shelf. But later on, of course, it will be turned into this massive militarized islands that we see today, based on the satellite imagery. So in fairness to Ramos, I would say of the 4 strategic junctures that we discussed, I think Ramos did his best. But there were some shifts to come later on in the coming years. And I'll try to end by, Sir Raul, andyan ka ba? Sorry. Because I think we have to take a slight break shortly. Mga siguro mga 10 minutes. Then we can come back with the second part of my lecture, then go to the question and answer. Is that okay? So
It's okay.
Yeah. Kasi alam ko medyo baka ma-overwhelm ang tao, no? I mean, you could say I'm already myself over, but there's just so much to discuss, but I'm trying to compress this, no? Because I think it's very important to discuss the history here before we go to Duterte. So the second part will be Duterte. But let me try to end the first part of my second lecture now. So under Arroyo, we have a short honeymoon. In fact, under Estrada, we essentially had, one of the reports that got my attention, I think it was a 1999 Time magazine article that said, literally, si Erap natulog during a national security briefing on the Spratlys and the Mischief Reef crisis. So Erap he essentially had strategic slumber as his approach. But under Arroyo, things got very, very interesting. No, so President Arroyo is quite a wily, she's definitely not naive, right? And I think she learned a thing or two from the time of Marcos, from the time of Ramos, no, and she realized that, well, China is indeed potentially the future, no, or it's going to be one of the 2 or 3 biggest powers in the world. And as far as Asia is concerned, it's perhaps on the trajectory to co-rule this part of the world with the US. Now, nonetheless, it took some push for Arroyo to move in that direction, no, and the push there, one big push there was the fallout with the Bush administration over the global war on terror. So if you remember it, Arroyo initially, no, we sent troops as part of the so-called coalition of the willing or coalition of on the willing. Ito yung mga maliliit na allies ng US na nag-contribute ng troops nung nag-invade ng US ng Iraq, no. Now, this was not sanctioned by the United Nations. This was opposed by France. If I'm not mistaken, even Germany. It was heavily criticized around the world. So the Bush administration kind of coaxed and cajoled smaller allies like the Philippines, a supposed non-NATO major ally, to contribute. And Arroyo did it. But if you remember, a Filipino FW was taken hostage by Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who later on will become ISIS, no? Daesh, no? Al-Nusra and Daesh. So Arroyo faced a very difficult situation. There were growing protests in the Philippines. A lot of you are young, but were some of us who were still around back then and a little bit still conscious about politics. Naalala ko, there were protests, there were calls for Arroyo to do something about it. And of course, the Al-Qaeda were saying, you have to withdraw your troops, otherwise we're going to behead the Filipino FW, right? So what happened is that Arroyo eventually gave in, because Arroyo was quite an unpopular president. In fact, the most unpopular president on record as far as we have. No, I mean, her net approval were negative a lot of times. And her 2004 presidential elections, well, hello, Garci, no? We don't have time to go into that. So Arroyo was not in a mood to inspire further backlash against herself. So she chose to rather piss off the Americans than piss off the Filipino people more. No, so she withdrew. No, so we withdrew our troops from the coalition of the willing, and the Bush administration was livid. They were angry. No, they bashed us. The Australians also back then, they're acting like deputy sheriff of Americans back then, also bashed us. What did Arroyo do? She went to China. She immediately went to China, and the Chinese also, when Jiabao, their premier, visited the Philippines. So what she did, she really in your face used the China card. No, and this was actually an interesting move. So actually, if you look at it, it seems like a reasonable move on her part. And not to mention, at this time, despite the mischief reef incident, the Chinese were still not a kind of a scary major power that many people think China is today. China was still a rising power, and despite the mischief reef crisis, the level of aggressiveness of China in the South China Sea was relatively moderated compared to what we see in the past 10 years under President Xi Jinping. So Arroyo goes to China. We sign. Again, we already see intimations of what's happening under Duterte, because Arroyo has been one of the de facto advisors of President Duterte on foreign policy. So a lot of Duterte's foreign policy in China is inspired by Arroyo. So Arroyo uses the China card, pushes back against the Americans. And I saw in some WikiLeaks cable, even the Americans were impressed, especially when Wen Jiabao visited the Philippines in the mid-2000s. We signed a joint seismic undertaking, kind of a joint exploration agreement with the Chinese in the South China Sea. We brought in also the Vietnamese to make it look more multilateral. And then, of course, there were big Chinese promises of infrastructure investment. You had the NBNZTE, North Railway Project, so on and so forth. So here we have some very interesting situation, and we see intimations of that under President Duterte. No? So my preview na tayo under Arroyo. Now, the problem, though, was, Arroyo probably rightly used the China card to make the Americans back off a little bit, to create more room for maneuver for herself and in general for the Philippines, right? And I think to a certain degree, you can welcome that. But the problem was that, the so-called golden age was undermined by badly negotiated deals. So the joint JMSU, for instance, many would say is unconstitutional. There are secrecy clauses there, and it potentially undermines the Philippines' sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. For that reason, later on, it was not renewed and just relapsed, Although there were cases filed, there were pushes, there were efforts by civil society groups to have it declared unconstitutional by the Philippine Supreme Court. And then the economic projects by China, they also went very badly, especially the NBNZTE deal. massive corruption issue, naging scandal yan. And that really, galvanized people not only against the Arroyo administration, even further towards the late 2000s, but also against China. And that is the context within which President Aquino comes into the picture. No, so when President Aquino came to power, it was his campaign was really both against corruption, so all the Don Matuid, but because China was also heavily involved in a lot of big projects under Arroyo, in many ways his anti-corruption initiative also was kind of anti-China, right? So because there's some sort of connection between the two, no? Because if you remember back in the days, unlocking issuing NBNZT, and later on we also had the Supreme Court declare the North Railway project with China as also unconstitutional because the bidding procedures were highly questionable. So what happened here is this: interesting intentions, interesting maneuver, bad execution, badly negotiated deal, so it backfired. So this honeymoon was really short-lived, and actually it set the stage for a much more China hawkish kind of politics in the Philippines, and it really strengthened anti-China sentiments. And it's sad because that, I think, was a great opportunity for the Philippines to diversify strategic options, but also for China to show to the Philippines that they can be actually a reliable partner or not. But I think they overread they overread their influence in the Philippines, and they thought, they got Arroyo on their side, so they can just do whatever they want. No, and I think that's where things got a little bit ugly. I mean, had the Chinese been a little bit more circumspect and they gave out really better deals, and siguro naman, I mean, in fairness naman, it's also not China's fault na napaka-corrupt yung some of the countries that they deal with, no? So the Chinese eventually got also ensnared in our domestic politics and our very corrupt bureaucracy. And that's set the stage for the Aquino administration. Parallels of that, by the way, would happen in Sri Lanka a few years later, when again, an opposition candidate comes into power on the back of lambasting an incumbent being close to China and accusing an incumbent of selling out the country. The whole debt trap issue would be a big issue in Sri Lanka. And then later on in 2008, the same thing will happen in Malaysia when former Prime Minister Mahathir will come back to power by attacking the Najib administration of being too close to China and also of essentially drowning Malaysia in debt traps. So what happened in the Philippines in the transition from Arroyo to Aquino would also be echoed in other countries in the region, from Sri Lanka to more especially in the case of Malaysia in 2018. So I'll end here for some break, siguro mga 5 to 10 minutes. And then let's go to the second part. We go from Aquino to Duterte, and then we'll try to analyze the trajectory of Philippine foreign policy. So the first part was really deep history. And I tried to compress it as much as possible within an hour. I hope that was helpful. So medyo break tayo dito, Sir Raul.
Yeah, okay. 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Yeah. Siguro mga 5 minutes should be fine. So anong oras ba? Can we be back at 3:45? So I think that's almost 10 minutes pala, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, 3:45. Then we go to Duterte. No, sorry, I need to just refresh myself. But I think you already have an idea what the course will look like, right? So it will be deep history and this strategic juncture. So a kind of a political scientist view on history. That's what we're gonna do. Of course, I welcome historians questioning some of my characterization and all. We can go into that, no problem. But I think my general arguments will still stand. No, okay. So. Break tayo, be back at 3:45. Then we go to from Aquino to Duterte, and then what can happen next, no? Because I think that in itself deserves its own lecture, no? So maraming salamat and talk to you soon.
All right, thank you, Prof. Heydarian, for the first part of our discussion. Before proceeding to the second part, let us all take a 10-minute break and be back at 3:45. Thank you.
Allow me to share with you my vision for the university. I envision PUP to become the pioneering and leading national polytechnic university in the 21st century. With a national polytechnic university status, it will bring more opportunities for the university to further strengthen its academic programs and improve organizational performance as an institution for higher education. In pursuit for this vision, my mission for PUP is for it to recognize its catalytic role for national development. PUP will ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities through a re-engineered polytechnic education. By re-engineering, we look into the existing processes and programs in order to achieve higher quality of academic programs and services following the principles of effectiveness and efficiency. With this mission in mind, I have formulated 10 pillars as my reform agenda for the university. Pillar 1, Dynamic, Transformational, and Responsible Leadership. Empower academic and administrative leaders by following the core principles of good governance to create collective growth and unity. Here I would like to highlight an innovation by introducing the development of an integrity management plan to assess, plan, and implement anti-corruption strategies that will secure the institution against corruption and abuse. Likewise, asset management and resource generation will be aggressively pursued to ensure productivity and finance the implementation of the plans and projects for the university. Pillar 2, Responsive and Innovative Curricula and Instruction. We aim to provide world-class polytechnic education that responds to national and global needs by developing intellectually challenging curricula and design academic programs that are based on industry demands to provide the learners with adequate and relevant competencies and skills and prepare them for a successful and rewarding careers. In a rapidly changing world, we recognize the paradigm shift in curriculum to outcome-based education with lifelong learning approach. Pillar 2 also sits on the framework of internationalization of Philippine higher education through transnational education by promoting academic mobility among faculty and students and global dimension into the curricula and teaching process. Pillar 3, Enabling and Productive Learning Environment. Following education in Industry 4.0, we aim to increase and enhance the use of new technology to enable student learning and engagement, as well as advanced teaching process and methodology through new and state-of-the-art facilities that will support the overall learning and teaching experience in the university. Pillar 3 likewise includes campus development and the provision of conducive learning centers and facilities for students and faculty. Pillar 4, Holistic Student Development and Engagement. We will empower students as well as rounded learners and active young leaders as we open opportunities for various academic mobility and venues for honing skills and personal development, being the principal stakeholder of the university. Recognize academic freedom as a form of self-expression and a platform to showcase students' intellect, skills, and creativity. Pillar 5, Empowered faculty members and employees. Likewise, we are looking into the holistic development of our faculty and employees as productive, competent, and experts in their respective fields. We will encourage our faculty roster through formal education, capacity building, research and extension initiatives, faculty immersion, and other academic engagements, both local and abroad. We will ensure that both our faculty and employees will have a vibrant career development path as public servants in this state university. Pillar 6, Vigorous research production and utilization. We will continue to strengthen the research culture in the university by promoting discovery and innovation through increasing disciplinary and collaborative research integration across academic disciplines to create new knowledge, utilize research findings, and develop innovative products. Pillar 7, Global Academic Standards and Excellence. Achieve the highest levels of recognition in quality and compliance standards from CHED, AACUP, and other international accrediting and regulatory bodies for higher education. We will intensify our efforts to achieve and sustain better academic performance and continue to excel as a top-performing school in various professional licensure examinations and produce board top-notchers, as well as sustain our status of being the most preferred graduates of employers. Likewise, we aim to establish and to be recognized as centers of development and excellence in our academic programs. Pillar 8, Synergistic, Productive Strategic Networks and Partnerships. Synergize and forge strategic linkages and partnerships across all sectors of society and the global community in line with the overall plans and programs of the university. Establish alliance with the government, industry sector, NGOs, and the academe will lead to resource sharing, program support, and research collaborations beneficial for all. Pillar 9, Active and Sustained Stakeholders Engagement. Harness a healthy and harmonious organization by empowering all its stakeholders, both internal and external, through open communication networks, consultative and participative undertakings, and team-building activities, recognizing that all stakeholders can greatly contribute towards the betterment of the university. Pillar 10, Sustainable Social Development Programs and Projects. Expand access to education, knowledge building, and information dissemination through sharing of expertise and resources for community development. Support inclusivity approach and education by embarking on Education on Wheels, which aims to bring access to education closer to communities, following the principle of no one will be left behind. As the University of the People, we should bring the university closer to their hearts to serve their needs and extend assistance in mainstreaming public service. Our institution must continue to stand as one for the values that we have inculcated. For the past 115 years, we have exemplified our quest for truth, excellence, equity, relevance, effectiveness, integrity, and academic freedom. Lastly, I call upon each and everyone to join me in this journey. Together we stand as one para sa sintang paaralan para sa ating bayan.
Okay. Okay na tayo. Transition back na tayo. Leia?
Yes, Prof.
Yes, thank you
You
very
may
much.
proceed.
Yes. Sorry, I had to also update mukhang may mga developments na nangyari sa election natin. It's quite looking like Vice President Robredo will run for the presidency. But let's see. Things are shaping up. I was expecting the Marcoses to make an announcement to also know. Pasensya na kasi ako naman may pagka-ADHD all over the place, no? So I'm outdating on everything. But I hope folks are still there. Wag niyo akong iwanan. We still have question and answers to come. So ganito na lang. I'm not gonna cover everything under the sun. I mean, ang dami na natin na-cover. Essentially, I think 95 years na na-cover natin in the past hour. Now, let me cover the past 10 years in the next 30 minutes or so. And then set the stage for discussion. Okay, let me just say one thing. The good news is practically everything I'm saying here, I've written them, and a lot of these writings are actually available online for free, right? But you're always welcome to buy my books and read my journal articles or read my forthcoming book. No? So obviously there are many sub issues and micro data and all that I won't have time to focus on. So this lecture is more like bullet points and patikim, no? So I look forward to the question and answer portion. So I'll try to compress a bit the past 10 years, which is like crazy past 10 years. I mean, as Lenin said, sometimes decades go by and you feel nothing, and sometimes a week go by and you feel a decade happened. No, so in the past decade, it seems like a century happened. To paraphrase Lenin. So let's go to the Aquino Duterte issue. no, and try to set the stage for our discussions of what could be the future of the Philippine policy. So, nakita nyo, ang pinakita ko over the past hour and so is that the Philippines has been at this crossroads over and over and over again. So hindi ito yung first time na nasa crossroads tayo. And depending on how you look at it, historically and strategically, some of our leaders did better than other leaders. And by the way, in my book and works, I do not just focus on our political leaders. It is true that per our constitution, and especially 1987 constitution, the chief architect of our foreign policy is the president. So indeed, the president has a lot of influence on how our foreign policy is conducted and formulated and so on. But the reality is that the Philippines is still a democratic country. And at the same time, as I will discuss later on, we also have the phenomenon of the double government. So I discussed a lot about our presidents a while ago and how they navigated relations with different superpowers. I also a little bit give you some idea about the opinion pulse of the Filipino people, and we will discuss that a little bit more later on. But what I'm going to discuss more, especially once we go to the Duterte administration, is also the role of the defense establishment, or what you can call the steady state, not the deep state, but the steady state, which has played a very important role in moderating, taming some of the excesses of President Duterte's rebalancing over the past few years. But let's go back to our lecture, and let's go back to Aquino and Arroyo. And I think, Aquino and Duterte. Aquino and Duterte, I kind of put them together. I mean, the whole Aquino administration policy can be a whole lecture in itself. But clearly under Aquino, it's not like he wanted to start on a confrontational basis with China. In fact, he tried to reach out to the Chinese in 2011. I think this was on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Vladivostok. But remember, meron din tayong Hong Kong hostage crisis nung time na yan. And actually, that was the first time I think I heard from Isko Moreno. Vice Mayor yata siya ng Manila noon. And then I think there was an interview with Christian Amanpour or someone in CNN. So I think many people remember that not so impressive interview that Isko Moreno back in the days had with CNN. No? And of course, many people made fun of his supposedly baluktut English and all of that. So I'm really impressed by how far Isko Moreno has come over the past 10 years. No? Just looking at that. Kasi very interesting yun. Kasi 2011, 2010, ito yung mga hostage crisis time. So the relationship were a little bit testy when Aquino came. And of course, Aquino made also some very tough statements and also made some tough moves when it comes to Chinese investments in the Philippines and reversed a lot of gains that China made under Arroyo. No? So China was not very happy with him. At the same time, of course, Aquino administration also welcomed the U.S. pivot to Asia, which was announced, if I'm not mistaken, around November in a speech that President Obama gave in Australia. So China was unhappy with many things, and at some point, Hu Jintao even refused to meet Aquino. From what I remember, actually, I wrote an article on that in Asia Times, I think, back in the days. No, but things get really ugly in 2012, as you remember, because of the Scarborough Shoal crisis. No, now again, ang laking issue yung Scarborough Shoal crisis itself. There are different versions of blame game we can play here. No, of course, the one version is kasalanan ng Trillanes yan because he badly negotiated the mutual disengagement deal. Some would say, well, kasalanan ng US yan because the US did not help us when we asked for their help. And actually, just to tell you, I heard Americans making that criticism against the Obama administration. There's also a version that blames the Philippines for sending a warship, a frigate, to apprehend the Chinese fishermen illegally operating Scarborough Shoal. So by doing that, we escalated the situation right away and gave essentially a pretext to the Chinese to send an armada of well-armed Coast Guard forces, no? At na salami slice tayo doon, no? So there are many versions, no? But I would fundamentally argue that the Scarborough Shoal crisis is a reflection of China's rising assertiveness in the South China Sea, no? And it was a preview of what was to come a year later under President Xi Jinping, right? Who has had a much more whiplash approach to foreign policy, since the end of Mao era. No, he's the most aggressive Chinese leader since the end of the Maoist era. So Deng Xiaoping, when he became leader of China, he made it very clear. We discussed that in the previous lecture. Hide your claws, right? Hide your ambitions. Do not alienate neighbors. So that kind of Deng Xiaoping approach was very much would be discarded by President Xi Jinping, no, once he comes into power into 2013. But so Aquino started relationship a little bit testy with the Chinese, but in 2011 pa lang, and I discussed that in my books and works, the Chinese are already doing some worrying things in the South China Sea. For instance, hinaharas nila yung ating energy exploration activities na sana gagawin natin sa reed bank. So alam natin yung Malampay ay papaubos na. So we have serious energy security considerations. But ang nangyari is that whenever we want to do some preliminary seismic undertaking or some exploration activity together with foreign companies, the Chinese will come and harass them. So the Chinese prevented us from actually exploiting and exploring energy resources within our continental shelf and within our exclusive economic zone. So there was a background to that. The Vietnamese also got a lot of harassment, their fishermen, their energy activities. So it's not like not much was happening after the mischief reef as far as Philippine-China relations is concerned. There was a lot also happening on the ground in the South China Sea by the time that Aquino came into power. So by 2012, the Scarborough Shoal happened. The mutual disengagement deal did not work. We can come up with 10 versions of why it didn't work. But I would say that, yes, the Obama administration did not stand by us the way we expected them. That created a lot of frustration in the Philippines on the part of the Aquino administration and the Department of Foreign Affairs. So much for a pivot to Asia. So much for Obama promising to assert American leadership in this part of the world. That's true. That's an argument I've made and I'll continue to make because that's the truth. Yes, I think it was a mistake for us not to send the Coast Guard, but the problem is that yun nga, hindi tayo nag-invest sa ating basic capabilities, including our Coast Guard. Kung may multi-role vessel sana tayo, then we would have sent our Coast Guard forces and the situation would not have escalated to the naval standoff that we saw back in 2012. I mean, you see, in military affairs, there's a concept called escalation dominance. No, so when you're with a bigger power, the last thing you want to do is to escalate the situation because at higher levels of escalation, they will always have the upper hand. Whatever ship you put there, they have a ship 10 times bigger. So you never want to escalate the situation unnecessarily, unless you really have a backing of an even bigger power, which we didn't have in 2012. So we were also paying the price for that, for not developing our Coast Guard capabilities and domain awareness. We were also paying the price, and I raised it with President Ramos in a conversation back in 2019. Bakit tayo hindi nag-establish ng lighthouse dyan sa Scarborough Shoal? Because there were already proposals of establishing some rudimentary structure dyan sa Scarborough Shoal for effective and continuous exercise of our sovereignty there. It's one thing for you to claim things and put names on them. It's another thing if you have structures there. No, my good friend, attorney Professor J. Batumbakal has great lectures on Scarborough Shoal. Please follow his works there. But what I'm telling you here is that we could have even avoided the whole situation had we earlier established structures and some presence, literally concrete presence, dyan sa Scarborough Shoal, the way that under Marcos we established literally concrete presence on Pag-asa. So this was a big frustration, and I raised this with President Ramos. The kind of answer I got from him was like kind of fuzzy, parang walang pera or something like that, which I cannot buy. I mean, like, so we had more money in 1970s than we had in 2000s or 90. I never got a satisfactory answer. There was another angle to this, which was also quite troubling. One report suggested, I think Marites Vitok has written on this also. One report suggested that we were supposed to build that lighthouse dyan sa Scarborough Shoal. But ang problema nangyari dyan is that someone who was supposed to do that or someone who was supposed to oversee that was gunning for some position in the United Nations or something like that. At sa tingin niya, baka maapektuhan yung kanyang, career options if the Philippines does something aggressive in the South China Sea. Remember, we are a signatory or a party to the DOC, and we are also a signatory to the UNCLOS. So for some people, maybe they were a little bit overcautious. Na building a lighthouse would be too provocative. But for me, this is a scramble. Hindi ito beauty contest. Hindi ito, I'm sorry, no, this is not a miscongeniality contest. This is serious geopolitics. And I think it would have been commonsensical for us to build some structures, have some presence there, because that's what we did in Pag-asa and that's what we did in Second Thomas Shoal, di ba? We grounded a rusty ship there sa Second Thomas Shoal, and we're deploying our marooned marines there. Kawawa sila doon, no? But to assert our claim over Second Thomas Shoal. So it's shocking for me that in a very fisheries-rich area like Scarborough Shoal, there was not really any kind of serious effort to assert the Philippines' sovereignty through continuous and effective exercise of that. No, so this was really quite shocking to me, and you can blame everyone for that. No, but to blame Aquino for that per se, I think kind of misses the point. No, so we can approach and slice the Scarborough disaster, for that matter, in many directions. No, but essentially many things went go wrong. But one thing that is very clear is this: the Chinese were clearly opportunistic. They saw the Americans were not reliable. They saw the Filipinos whimpering and withering and unsure. They saw internal politics in the Philippines. Nakita niyo yung after bumalik si, I think, Trillanes, may away sila ni Enrile. I think back then Enrile was the Senate president. It was a mess. It was a mess. You had people bad-mouthing our ambassador in Beijing. I think 2 of our ambassadors, they had a heart attack or problems back in the days. I mean, like, grabe, no? Like, it was a total meltdown, no? So that was the context of Scarborough. And obviously, we did not have the requisite capabilities, and we were smart enough not to escalate it militarily with the Chinese, because after the supposed mutual disengagement deal, parang nangyari is, just to simplify it, we withdraw Gregorio del Pilar, they withdraw some of their Coast Guard force, and then nagpadala sila ng armada ng Coast Guard and all, and essentially they sealed off Scarborough since mid-2012. So China now exercises effective jurisdiction, no, not legal but effective control, no, administrative control over Scarborough. And this is, and that crisis should have been huge wake-up call. Something really went wrong in our foreign policy, in our preparations, in terms of defending our rights, and also in terms of our relations with the United States. Something did not click there. Something did not work. No. Now, when it comes to response, obviously this was a very embarrassing, politically explosive moment for Aquino. So Aquino was scrambling for any possible response, no, short of military confrontation. So obviously he adopted a much more aggressive diplomatic language, and he strengthened our relations with Japan. I think he made and dominant visits to Japan, and he kind of promoted Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan's efforts to make Japan a much more consequential and assertive strategic player, though, including in terms of defense relations with neighboring countries like the Philippines. He continued to support the pivot to Asia, and so we moved on 2 fronts. No, first, and I think Secretary Del Rosario, among others, first they pushed for legal warfare. So this was a very unsure, risky move, and no one knew if it will work, because the number one question is jurisdiction, right? China has made it very clear that they're not gonna submit themselves to any arbitration case that involves sovereignty issues. So how do you approach this? No, so the legal warfare maneuver was really risky and unsure. I think Aquino himself was unsure about this, but we saw eventually it worked because our lawyers were so smart, right? So they kind of skirted around the sovereignty issue, but focused on sovereign rights and maritime entitlements. So they really work around it and leverage Article 287, Annex 7 of the UNCLOS, no, on compulsory arbitration. So even if China didn't want to be a part of it, there is a compulsory arbitration mechanism under UNCLOS. Again, this is not a lecture on legal warfare, international law, but I'm just giving you an idea about that. The other front that we moved was we pushed for the negotiations of what will eventually be known as the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. No, so the EDCA was supposed to bring in Americans, even in its it was supposed to give the Americans even larger and expanded military presence in the Philippines, short of permanent presence. So expanded rotational presence. So they tried to work around this kind of a constitutional ban against permanent bases. So under the EDCA, the Americans, these were the initial proposals. The Philippines was hoping the Americans would even lease some of their submarines and major warships to the Philippines, and in exchange, they will have more access to some key bases like Basa Air Base and Bautista Air Base. Na yung isa malapit sa Scarborough, Pangasinan, yung isa sa Palawan, malapit sa Spratlys. No? Eventually, there was back and forth, and the EDCA that came out of that was very toned down version of the initial version that I think the Philippines was asking for. As for the arbitration award, it moved forward in leaps and bounds. And guess what? President Duterte says, oh, if you assert arbitration with China, or if you assert your claims, magkakaroon ng giyera. Guess what? There was no war with China. Aquino lambasted the Chinese. He even likened them to Nazi Germany in his speech before the Japanese Diet. We canceled all agreements, all major infrastructure agreements with them. But guess what? Trade with China did not suffer. Investment from China still came in, especially private investments, not big ticket infrastructure, but it didn't also come under Duterte. No, and then as far as Aquino is concerned, we didn't see any kind of an incident that we saw under Duterte, which is like the reed bank incident. So even though Aquino took a very hard line against the Chinese, we did not have war with them. They did not impose really serious trade or investment sanctions against the Philippines. Moreover, there was no incident like reed bank, whereby they'll just send a militia, or some of their militia will just ram and almost kill 22 of our fishermen. That happened under Duterte's watch, not under Aquino. So Aquino's days is also a testament to the fact that if you stand strong and assert yourself, the Chinese might even reluctantly respect you, right? Or take you even more seriously, right? So this was the message that I think we should get from the Aquino years. I have some disagreements with our policy back then. For instance, my major disagreement with the previous administration is that we did not upgrade and maintain yung facilities natin in a serious sense, no? Yung facilities natin sa Pag-asa. Pinabayaan natin. And I raised this issue with Secretary Del Rosario back in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. One-on-one, I raised this issue, not one-on-one, sorry, during a meeting, I raised this issue to him personally, and I said, well, the on clause in international law is not against us maintaining and upgrading pre-existing facilities, and also, we're not here changing the nature of the disputed land features. Hindi naman natin gagawin na giant island yung isang rock. No, hindi natin gagalawin yung geological features ng Pag-asa. We're just gonna maintain yung ano natin, no, yung facilities natin, medyo upgrade natin para naman yung mga tao natin diyan, yung civilians natin, yung military natin, no, they have much more robust infrastructure there to defend our claims, and also to live, no, because they have to be there in the middle of nowhere, no. But the Aquino administration turned it down because dapat daw meron tayong moral high ground and all, and I think that was a very weak argument. I'll just be brutally honest about that. I felt as important as the arbitration award was, we're putting all our eggs inside that basket, and I think that's problematic, because we should be under no illusion that legal warfare alone will work. The legal warfare of the Aquino administration gave us a leverage that we wouldn't have had otherwise. What is the leverage? The Chinese want to be seen as a global leader. They don't want to be seen as an outlaw. And that arbitration award victory gave us some leverage to threaten the Chinese with international embarrassment and pressure, and also to set the precedence for Vietnam and other countries to also file arbitration cases, or help other countries to file similar cases. We could have done that. And that's the leverage we got from the arbitration award. Not to mention the arbitration award was far more favorable if you look at the outcome, no, the final document. I mean, the ruling was really in our favor way more than we thought on many issues. Not only was the 9-dash line and the historic rights claim of China really tossed out of the window, even China's ecologically damaging activities, yung massive reclamation activities, it was criticized, no, on environmental grounds. Even their harassment of our fishermen, yung mga ating mga inista na gusto pumunta sa Scarborough Shoal, that was also criticized, because the Scarborough Shoal is supposed to be a common fishing ground. So the court did not decide on sovereignty issue, who owns what island. First of all, the court said there's no island in the area, so China cannot say, oh, we have this island and let's claim another 200 nautical miles. Eh, di abot ka ng lampas ka ng Palawan, di ba? They struck it down. And they also made it clear that, they reaffirmed the Philippines essentially exclusive economic rights in large parts of the West Philippine Sea. No, so that leverage would not have been existent had the Aquino administration not take the leap of faith, which a lot of us, to be honest, at first we were also a little bit skeptical about it. But to think that legal warfare alone, or just relying on America alone, would do it, I think misses the point. Because as I mentioned a while ago, Ramos showed the way. You have to move on multiple fronts. Work through ASEAN and with ASEAN. Try to bring in Americans and make them more reliable. Extract more from our alliance, but also engage directly the Chinese. Do not bash them. Do not attack them. Engage them directly. Try to finesse your way through it. Schmooze diplomatically if you need to. But because that will give us more time to also build up our capabilities. And yes, move ahead with modernizing the AFP. In fairness, though, to the Aquino administration, in 2011 onwards, we started investing, more than $1 billion, no, in developing our naval and air force capabilities. So under Aquino, we got back to the supersonic era, the FA-50 fighters we got from Korea, and we started to also upgrade and get new frigates. And in fairness to the Duterte administration, they have continued some of these policies, which brings me really to the meat of the discussion. So the really bizarre thing is that many people are expecting the arbitration award to come out in 2015 or early 2016 nung nandun pa si Aquino. But for some strange reason, it came out when wala na si Aquino at Duterte came into power. So Duterte immediately had a geopolitical crisis, right, on his lap. And I don't think he was really ready for that. I think that was really a challenging moment for President Duterte. So that is why if you look at President Duterte, in his interviews in March, throughout the election process, and after he became the Philippine president in 2016, he made it very clear he wants a soft landing with China because he genuinely feared that things could get out of control. And I can't blame President Duterte because as we discuss in the next slide, there are 5 elements that explain Duterte's foreign policy and you know, why it is what it is and what are the implications. I mean, first of all, you have to understand that when President Duterte ran for office, his campaign was not only about, you know, bringing some sort of a more authoritarian populist style of governance. It was not only against crime, criminality, and drugs, but if you look at it, there was this one picture whereby the president will essentially clad himself in the Filipino flag and essentially say, lahat yung mga yan, mga liberal, yung mga kalaban niya, mga tuta ng Amerika. You know? I mean, he didn't use those words, but that was more or less his message, that I'm truly the first nationalist president in a very, very long time. So remember, that's why the first part of this lecture was all the background I was talking about. Now, so Duterte comes in. I mean, Duterte is almost as old as the independent Philippines. No, I was like, he was born in the 1940s. The Philippines also gained its independence in the 1940s, right? So he's almost coterminous with this post-war Philippine Republic, right? So he has a personal memory of this, no? And he was also radicalized in the 1970s during the Vietnam War, which I'll discuss also here. But you see, when Duterte ran, he was not just rejecting the post-Marcosian EDSA democracy or the oligarchy, liberal oligarchy in the country. He was also rejecting their foreign policy and their perceived and real subservience to America, right? But on the second level, if you look at Duterte, he's Machiavellian. I mean, he's not an idiot. I mean, the guy really analyzes the balance of forces on the ground, no? And I'll discuss that more later on. But look at Duterte. Once he becomes the president, immediately his popularity shoots to 80-90%. PDP Laban goes from 3 members to 300 members. Much of the Philippine political establishment essentially folds over and embraces the guy and rallies and bandwagons around him. So if you're Duterte, it's like, wait, I was a dark horse in the race. I was called NPA, Chinese Manchurian candidate, and all of this. I said everything, all sorts of causes, what you can imagine. He attacked everything that the Filipinos perhaps hold sacred in every way. And yet, here he is, extremely popular, most popular president. And at the same time, you have the whole political establishment essentially defecting to him, right? In one way or another. So that rapid concentration of executive power, that authoritarianization, I think really emboldened Duterte to say, I'm not here to only go against the EDSA regime, right? But I'm also here to really overhaul the Philippines' foreign policy and its place in the world. And that's why he felt comfortable to introduce some really major changes, no? But before going to the China part, we have to discuss the American part, the strategic ambivalence on the part of America. So I discussed a while ago, under the Nixon administration, ang position ng America was that we are neutral on the sovereignty claims, disputes in the area, wala tayong direct claims there. We believe in freedom of navigation and overflight. And then vaguely, the Mutual Defense Treaty covers the Philippines, covers alliance with the Philippines in the context of the Pacific. There was no specification of South China Sea per se. And then if you look at the provisions of the MDT, the US can respond and help us in accordance to constitutional processes. What on earth is that? So meaning dapat i-consulta yung Kongreso nila, Supreme Court nila. I don't know what that means. So there's some vagueness also about the MDT. And from Nixon all the way to Obama, multiple American administration, both Republican and Democratic, kind of exploited and kind of worked within and through these ambiguities in the very text of our Mutual Defense Treaty and in the very fabric of our alliance with the United States. And look at the Obama administration. They were not there with us during the Scarborough Show the way we needed them and we expected them. That was one big disappointment. 2014, Obama comes to Manila after his visit shortly before to Japan. In Japan, he clearly says the Senkaku or what the Chinese call Diaoyu Islands, are covered by the Mutual Defense Treaty between Japan and the United States. He was crystal clear about that. He comes to Manila. He's asked a question, will Americans stand by the Philippines? By not one, but two journalists. I remember this very well. I watched this live. Good friends of mine, Roy Mabasa, I think from Manila Bulletin, and another good friend of mine from ABS-CBN, no? They asked Obama a question, standing next with Aquino. What was the response of Obama? A lawyerly, ambiguous answer, something like, and almost insultingly, Obama said, we don't go to war over a bunch of rocks. And then he said, like, oh, we and Canada have disputes, but blah, blah, blah. But, you know, China is not Canada, last time I checked, right? So Obama comes in, few hours later, we signed the ETCA, but Obama made it very clear that they're not going to firmly stand with us. No, and that's a very much a legacy of the Nixon approach to the South China Sea disputes and the inherent legal and strategic ambiguities as far as our alliance is concerned. And even worse, when the arbitration comes out in July of 2016, what does Obama do? He sends Susan Rice, his national security advisor, not to Manila, but to Beijing, as if Beijing was the slighted party, right? To kind of mollify China. When in fact, we would have expected Obama to send his most senior officials to Manila to stand in solidarity with us and to stand with us and say, don't worry, let's assert this arbitration award, defend your rights. Which brings me to the fourth issue. If you look at it, the Chinese were very clear about their terms of engagement with Duterte. Now, putting aside conspiracy theories or rumors and all, the reality is that especially former Chinese ambassador was constantly in conversation with Duterte. I think siguro pag may logbook ng Malacanang, yung Chinese ambassador yung pinaka-present dyan, no? And the reason is because the Chinese made it very clear to Duterte, you know, if you play it nice, you don't assert this arbitration award and embarrass us, you can get a lot of investments, which obviously would not come later on, as we can discuss. But the other thing, they made it very clear. Remember, in the days that this arbitration was happening, the Chinese sent a nuclear-capable bombers to the Scarborough Shoal. They were conducting drills in the area. Li Keqiang, the Chinese premier, made huge threat, made it very clear they would not compromise on their claims in the area. So the Chinese were essentially saying, play it nice, we can smoothly go through this, and you might even get some big investments. And by the way, you're welcome to visit Beijing anytime soon as your first major foreign trip. No. And then at the same time, they made it clear, if you want to stand up, no, and do something funny there, we will make it hell for you. And look at the Americans. Look at Obama. Is he standing with you? By the way, he's a lame duck president in his last month in office. And it didn't help, which brings me to the fifth factor, that the Obama administration took on Duterte on the war on drugs issue. Again, I personally, my stance is very clear on the war on drugs. I'm against AJKs. I think the war on drugs was sloppy and badly executed. I think the PNP was not, walang due diligence. No? The bara-bara, no? But you see, we're talking about, there's no but actually. In the case of foreign affairs, you have to be delicate with your language. And Obama was not. You see, when Obama is asked about Saudi Arabia, he says, oh, I'm going to go to Saudi Arabia and meet the king of Saudi Arabia. We're going to discuss a whole range of issues, regional security. And then towards the end, he raises the issue of human rights. And by the way, Saudi Arabia is really an authoritarian system, one of the worst records on human rights, right? Through and through, no? Egypt, similar language, a lot of authoritarian systems. When Obama meets their leaders, he doesn't go front and center and focus on the human rights issue. Guess what? That's what he did vis-a-vis Duterte. No? And that's the context within which Duterte lost his temper and nagmura-mura siya. Yes, nagmura siya. Let's not kid ourselves. No? So Duterte was really pissed off when Obama, made the issue of human rights front and center, criticized him. Not to mention Goldberg, the American ambassador, who I think was kicked out of Bolivia before or something. There's another backstory to that. Goldberg also criticized Duterte on war on drugs. Duterte, let's not forget, this is a guy who uses a lot of I, me, and myself as far as our foreign policy is concerned. Sometimes he identifies himself with the state. He identifies, l'état c'est moi, right? I am the state. He has that kind of megalomaniac tendency too, right? So that was sloppy foreign policy in the part of Americans. And I think the Americans took the Philippines for granted. They thought they can say whatever they want to say. Duterte is just all big talk during elections. He's going to be fine. Guess what? Duterte is different. This is the guy, right, who had Joma Sison as his teacher in Introduction to Political Theory. This is a guy who was a buddy buds with Nur Miswari, right? This is a guy who was a student during Vietnam War. This is a guy, right, who is still angry at America for the marrying incident in Davao. We don't have time to go to the marrying incident, but you can research that, no? This is a guy who convinced the city council in Davao to block balikatan exercises within the area of jurisdiction of Mayor Duterte back then. You know, he has done things and said things that make him extremely different from all other Filipino politicians ever, right? And yet the Americans did not take him seriously, And Duterte really made this point clear in his first year in office. I'm going to do this differently. And I'm going to push forward what he believes is a truly independent foreign policy. Now, so if you look at it in the first year, some people who know me and saw my interviews in the first year, they kind of like misinterpreted, like, oh, it's Richard and Ian, spokesman with Duterte. But remember, I was talking in the first year when the foreign policy was taking shape, and based on conversation with senior officials in the administration and all, among others, my sense is that, you know, something has to change. We have to assert ourselves and make sure our alliance with the United States is really something useful. And at the same time, we have to avoid unnecessary conflict with China and re-engage the Chinese. I'm with that. But the problem was that good intentions was there perhaps in the beginning, or I gave the benefit of the doubt. There was good reason to really recalibrate our foreign policy because, you know, the status quo was not working. Aquino did his best, but, you know, the Americans were constantly unreliable through and through during the Aquino years. And confronting China, I don't think it was an option. You cannot choose your neighbors. Sometimes you can even choose probably your family members, but you cannot choose your neighbors in the case of China. So I was initially a little bit sympathetic to the need for recalibration, but it's the way the recalibration was executed. And it went off the trail that's where I became more critical of our foreign policy under President Duterte. No, what was, I believe, a sensible and reasonable push for diversification of our foreign relations and a much more which could have been a very astute way of navigating these fault lines, this US-China new Cold War. It went completely off the rail. And there are many factors that may explain that. And I think one basic factor is that President Duterte is an amateur when it comes to diplomacy. I mean, he's great in terms of communications. He's really a consummate politician. But this is not a guy with a lot of experience or background or knowledge on international politics, especially high-stakes international politics like this. And I'm not sure he was very aware of the nitty-gritties and nuances of international law and Chinese statecraft and all. I'm sorry, I just don't think he has that, right? So may maraming amateur hour na nangyari that kind of ruined some of the initially sensible things that were being said and discussed under the previous administration. And things really got ugly later on when you hear President Duterte essentially echoing the Chinese line in 2017 when he became the ASEAN chair. So the Chinese had all the reasons to have a nice relationship with Duterte and promise him heaven, $24 billion in investment because the Philippines was supposed to be the ASEAN chair next year. No, and Duterte really made it easy and lovely for the Chinese, right? So during his ASEAN chairmanship, he said the South China dispute should be left untouched, meaning U.S. external powers, umalis kayo dyan, leave it between us and China. And that's ridiculous because in that situation, China will dictate the terms. We alone have very limited capability to stand our ground when it comes to China, right? But if we have assistance from the international community, which by the way, continues to uphold the arbitration award of 2016. The Europeans, the Americans, the Australians, the Japanese, the Indians, all of them are invoking our arbitration award right and left to also justify their freedom of navigation and patrols and naval missions throughout the South China Sea and Taiwan Straits. No, so this is where, and Duterte's rhetoric didn't help. Calling China his protector, saying that we have to be meek and humble in exchange for China's mercy. So, and joking about the Philippines becoming province of China, maybe this is a funny in some barangay context, no, or some internal jokes behind the scenes. But when you're the head of the state, you're the chief architect of Philippine foreign policy, this is beyond embarrassing. This sends very wrong signals. This makes us look like a joke, right? As one American said, we cannot want Scarborough Shoal more than your president, right? If your president is making jokes right and left and saying, wala tayong magagawa and all of that, how are you going to encourage American officials saying, hey, we have to stand up to the Chinese for the Filipinos? How are you going to convince American people to support greater support for the Philippines? So you cannot say na istorya lang yan or don't take it out of context or joke lang yan. This is serious stuff, right? So maybe Duterte can pull this off in some other context, but not on the level of international affairs. But, and this is where I go to the really meat of my discussion, President Duterte does not have unilateral power over the Philippines' foreign defense policy. I've been saying this over and over again, right? In fact, I've been saying two things over and over again, and both have turned out right. So you can look at my op-ed in New York Times in 2017. You can look at my works in 2018. So two things I said. First, Yung China, they're going to just take Duterte for a ride because Duterte is already forward deploying a lot of concessions, right? I will not assert the arbitration award. He tried to downgrade our relations with US. He did not implement and operationalize EDCA. No, so the Chinese were getting a lot of concessions. So why bother and invest, right? And look at it. The Philippines has one of the lowest shares of Chinese investments in the region. Very small, like probably 1/50th of Laos or other countries, right? Zero big ticket infrastructure projects so far. And I've been saying this since 2018 pa lang, na this is a chimera. Forget about debt trap. Pag sinasabi debt trap, you say my investment. No, wala. So he was taken for a ride. But the second thing is the role of the Philippine Defense Establishment. So if you look at the Philippines, what's very interesting is this. I mean, Duterte did not end our NDT with the US, and later on we'll discuss not also the VFA, but he actually hampered the full operationalization of the EDCA. And he didn't give Americans the kind of access to put their pre-position their weapons and to build facilities and rotate their troops in places like Basa Air Base and Antonio Bautista Air Base. These were the 5 bases that were supposed to be open to Americans under EDCA. Duterte clipped that, and that was, I think, a major concession to the Chinese. But what did we get in exchange from China? For everything that Duterte has done, this is what we get. Even further militarization of the South China Sea disputes. The Chinese deploying SAMs, ACBMs, electronic jamming equipment, nuclear-capable bombers, doing major naval exercises in the area, fully militarizing and reclaiming those islands, and now even using militia forces to harass us. So there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that Duterte being nice to China has made the situation any better for us. In fact, the harassment of our fishermen, yung ating mangingisda, lumalala, we're losing, by some estimates, conservatively, more than $100 million per year in stolen fishery resources with all this illegal fishing by China and other countries in our area. So Duterte has nothing to show, either in terms of big ticket infrastructure investments or concessions in the ground, whether in Scarborough Shoal, whether in the South China Sea. So it's an absolute failure in that sense in terms of basic negotiating strategy. We had the leverage, we had the sets of leverage, and I don't think Duterte used them smartly. Nonetheless, it was not the end of the world, because my argument is that if you look at the Philippines, we have a dual government phenomenon. There have been internal pushbacks against some of the excesses of President Duterte's policy. Now, we see AFP, for instance, on multiple occasions saying it is their constitutional duty to protect the Philippines' territorial integrity. Sometimes, especially when Cayetano was our foreign secretary, they had to remind the DFA, hey, do your job. You're there to stand for our rights, not to explain or apologize for what China is doing or the shenanigans in the South China Sea. We also saw the AFP and the Philippine Defense Secretary and Defense Establishment also gradually restoring some of our important exercises with China, including the return of joint amphibious exercises in the South China Sea, in the Subic area, and restoring security cooperation with the US. In fact, there was an increase in the number of American and Filipino troops during the Balikatan exercises once it was restored after an initial cancellation early on in Duterte's term. The Americans also under under Trump, also recalibrated their policy. So America also made it very clear that they're going to be much more reliable than the previous administration. So under Trump administration and now under the Biden administration, the Americans did a couple of things. They increased the foreign military financing to the Philippines. They expanded their freedom of navigation operations in the area. They have deployed their Coast Guard to this area, and they're doing joint Coast Guard activities with the Philippines for the first time since the end of Cold War. And the Americans, beginning with Secretary Pompeo in 2019 March, and also with Secretary Blinken last November, and more recently, they also made it clear the mutual defense treaty with the Philippines applies to the South China Sea. Clear language on the level of the Secretary, and more importantly, they made it also clear that were the Filipino aircraft, personnel, or warships attacked by a third party in the South China Sea, the mutual defense treaty will be applicable. So this is a very clear thing. And actually, we did some surveys with some of the emerging leaders in the AFP, and their views are very interesting. Hindi po totoo na pro-American yung ating military. They're not. They have a very nuanced view. In fact, they're quite open to improving relations with US, and a lot of them, based on the study that we did, were open with, actually saw China in the next 20 years closing the gap with the US in terms of overall capability. But when we asked them, do you rather have us, when it comes to threat perceptions, the threat perception of emerging leaders within the Philippine defense establishment, China is like through the roof, right? Way more threat perception. Although medyo weird, US is still seen as a threat. I don't know how nowadays. Of course, back in the days, hindi ito panon ni Aguinaldo, but so. And if you look at the military also, you see so they see a high level of threat from China, right? But interestingly, most of them also prefer to have a more relationship with US over China, and to rely on US as a source of protection against China. So if you look at the Philippine defense establishment on multiple levels, cabinet members and defense secretary, the generals, the emerging leaders, based on all the interviews, conversations, and studies that we have had, it shows that they are not pro-America per se, but they're quite skeptical of China, right? And that is why we saw this back and forth between President Duterte and President Duterte trying to nullify the VFA dahil nawala ng si Bato, no? And of course, President Duterte is really concerned kasi meron nga tayong Global Magnitsky Act, no? So he could face sanctions for the human rights situation because of the war on drugs, no? So I think Duterte was really angry and panicked, and that's why he pushed for the abrogation of VFA. But immediately there was a pushback. Immediately, Lorenzana and Locsin came out and made this very strong statement that how important was the VFA in terms of HADR, in terms of counterterrorism, and also in terms of maritime security, no? But of course, Lorenzana emphasized really the more HADR part and counterterrorism, including during the Marawi crisis. And in fairness, Trump also tried to a little bit bring down tensions. Some of the mistakes by Obama, which is like openly attack Duterte, that stopped with Trump. Maybe Trump was a little bit too nice to Duterte. So I think that made it also easier for our defense establishment to a little bit restore our defense relationship with them. But let's not forget that the military, the defense establishment looks at Duterte, a very popular president. But if they also look at the popularity of a tougher stance in the South China Sea, if they look at the unpopularity of China, right, and popularity of the US, it also becomes easier for them to assert a much more patriotic position in the South China Sea within the state, no, and within the presidential cabinet and all. So if you look at it, service after service clearly say that they want the government to take a tougher stance in the South China Sea, right? And I think that has encouraged people in the military, in the cabinet of President Duterte to make a tougher statement. In fairness, President Duterte, or actually Cayetano at one point, himself probably under pressure, had to make clear that we actually have red lines when it comes to China. No reclamation of Panatag Shoal, no unilateral exploitation of energy resources, and no coercive expulsion of the Philippine Marine Detachment in the Second Thomas Shoal. And in fact, it was also internal pressure by the defense establishment, especially by DFA people, that also scuttled the plans for a resource sharing agreement or joint development agreement with China in the Reed Bank. It went nowhere because there was a pushback against it. And remember, when Xi Jinping was here in late 2018, Locsin gave an interview with, I think, Pinky Webb, when he openly said, so this is what I was saying a while ago, with Pinky Webb, and he said like there were some kind of like a pro-China guy trying to push us and force us to sign some questionable and potentially unconstitutional joint development agreement. They didn't do that. So you have many people in the DFA and the AFP and the defense secretary, who have been making sure that our patriotic positions are secured in one way or another. And as I said, under Trump and also now under Biden, we also see the Americans recalibrating and becoming much more reliable ally. And in fairness, in fact, when the Reed Bank incident happened, and amid all the backlash against President Duterte, and initially Secretary Lorenzana's very critical stance on the incident in the Reed Bank in 2019, former U.S. Ambassador Sung Kim said, that the MDT could even cover gray zone attacks, meaning militia attacks by China. And that's where discussions of revisions of our MDT guidelines or some changes to our MDT guidelines are coming to the picture, because maybe we need to tweak a little bit the MDT to be also relevant to gray zone threats, especially by Chinese militia forces, Jansa West Philippine Sea. Now, I'll try to end on this point, but I think the VFA saga has more or less reinforced this argument I've been making year after year and after year. President Duterte may be an imperial president when it comes to domestic politics. He got away with many things, some of them potentially even unconstitutional or illegal, right? And the war on drugs, he got away with it in one way or another, at least so far, and the pushback was very weak. But when it came to VFA, suddenly you have senators, top secretaries, our ambassadors, all of them right and left scrambling, right, to keep the VFA alive. And initially their strategy was to keep on renewing, to keep on postponing the abrogation, So they did that over and over and over again until when the U.S. new Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin came here, Duterte renewed the VFA. And there are many explanations for that. I think Duterte, in his twilight months in office, doesn't want to pick a fight with the Americans. If he's going to run for vice presidency, which could be a little bit controversial, you don't want to also pick a fight with the Americans. I think that the defense establishment in the Philippines also feels more encouraged to reassert the alliance with the United States. And I think the Biden administration, in fairness to Biden, he doesn't attack or criticize Duterte. I don't know if nag-usap ba sila at all. So I think the Biden administration has also been very astute with its diplomacy when it comes to dealing with the Philippines and President Duterte. And as far as Duterte is concerned, and I had an interview with Secretary Lorenzana right after also, is that it seems the vaccines from Biden kind of helped too. We are the second largest beneficiaries of US-made vaccines in terms of donations. More than 6 million was given to us. That's the second highest after Indonesia. And I think Vietnam is next to us, no, almost the same level. No, so I think the Biden administration also played this card very well. But our ambassador Romualdez in US, Foreign Secretary Locsin, all of them really worked together to eventually not only restore the VFA, but during the latest meetings, 2-on-2 meetings, when our Secretary Lorenzana and Secretary Locsin, when they visited DC, on the eve of the 70th anniversary of MDT, there were very serious discussions. And some of the discussions was that we need to have a new framework of agreement, framework of cooperation agreement on maritime security, and to implement the EDCA more fully. So actually, not only over the past few months, not only in restoring VFA, which is like the legal framework that allows for thousands of American troops to come in and out, but we are now also agreeing that we have to fully implement the EDCA so that we have more deterrence capability against China's encroachment into Philippine waters. So things are moving very, very, very fast. And in fact, there's also an agreement to resume strategic dialogue between the two countries at a very high level and 2+2 meetings. And Biden actually may meet Duterte on the sidelines of ASEAN later November. No, so very interesting. So I'll try to end on this note because there's so much more to discuss, but I felt we covered a lot of ground and I want to leave some time for question and answer. I hope that was still kind of comprehensive enough and gave you a flavor of what I believe is the right way to approach this issue. In short, there have been many mistakes, but Duterte is not the only one. And while there have been mistakes, there have been also good things that happened in the past few years. So I think over the past few years, one good thing that happened is that finally, thanks to Secretary Lorenzana, among others, we're upgrading and maintaining our facilities in Pag-asa. And Philippines is also continuing the modernization efforts of Aquino. So a national second horizon. Yes, we are a little bit delayed and all, but hopefully we can acquire F-16 fighters or SAP fighters to upgrade the capabilities of our Philippine Air Force. And even in the Philippine Navy, meron tayong, I think, BRP Rizal. We are also acquiring new submarines and corvettes and frigates. So we're moving in the right direction in some ways, in some very important ways. And the fruits of that will be felt a little bit more in the future. Hopefully, we don't have to even feel the fruits, because hopefully, if we can play our diplomacy well, we can also avoid war. So I'll end on that note and looking forward to the question and answer. Pasensya na, I mean, there's a lot I can discuss, especially the second part. I mean, I can just close my eyes and give you a lecture on that, because this is something I've been really, really passionate about. The stakes are very high. And I mean, I've written probably 2,000 articles. Half of that might be during the Duterte time. So you can read a lot of these things in details, no? So this PowerPoint is just supposed to give you a flavor of the overall approach I have in analyzing Philippine foreign policy and how we have been navigating different crossroads from Aguinaldo and the Battle of Manila, no, in the late 19th century, all the way to the Scarborough Shoal, Whitsun Reef, and of course, after President Duterte, as we enter a new era whereby America is no longer the major power. So I started, my lecture started with the emergence of America as an empire, and then we went through the Cold War years and the 20th century and early 21st century when America was the superpower, but that era is also ending. So that raises also new questions. All I'm saying here is this: we need to level up. We need leaders to have some basic idea about foreign policy and the nuances of statecraft. In short, wag tayo bumoto sa amateur hour. Wag tayo mapadala sa mga rhetoric lang or yung mga pangpatawa, no, yung mga jet ski jokes. This is not a joke, right? This is very serious. We made certain mistakes, but we also did something right. So hopefully we can do more correct decisions in the future. And in order for us to do that, we have to have the right president, right? And that's it, right? But thankfully, when it comes to the Philippines, as far as foreign policy is concerned, the people have a say. And responsible, patriotic people in the AFP, in the government also have a say. So it's not like president alone can decide everything. So there's a much more of interactive and participatory and inclusive element to that. And I hope to see more of that under our next presidents and presidents to come. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much. Mabuhay ang Pilipinas.
Thank you very much, Professor Heydarian, for that in-depth lecture and for bringing us back to our history to fully understand our present situation and what would be our future. Actually, the lecture made me appreciate the importance of forging and strengthening partnerships and building strategic relationships and alliances that can provide leverage to our country. At this point, we will open the floor for the open forum. And for those who would like to ask questions, please raise your virtual hand and wait to be acknowledged. Or you may also type your questions in the chat box.
Andiyan pa ba kayo? Baka iniwan niyo na ako. Ang tagal
They
natin
are-
lecture natin. 2.5 hours? Yeah.
They are
Inulit ko
attentively
na,
listening,
Raul,
sir.
I hope you don't regret inviting me. So I
Yeah,
think we'll have a flavor of what will be my courses when we teach hopefully subjects more with PUP. No? So ito, ano lang yun, patikim lang yun. You're gonna have a lot of that hopefully soon. No? We're gonna go really deep. Sige po, let's go with the questions. I mean, if there are 2-3 questions that similar, we can take them together and kind of rapid answer together. No?
I think
Yes,
we have
please.
a question from Miss Cecilia or Dr. Cecilia Suerte Felipe.
Yes po,
The
yes
question
po.
is, with what is happening in the South China Sea, China advancing their position, do you think it can be overturned if a candidate from the opposition wins?
Mhm.
Given that Isko Moreno is basically like Duterte, who is only exposed on local governance, do you think Isko will be basically the same like Duterte if he wins? And lastly, her question is, reading the body language of presidential daughter and Davao Mayor Sara Duterte Carpio, do you think she will run in the 2022 presidential elections? As well as the last question, with your vast knowledge and with the initial names now known as presidential candidates,
Right.
who do you think is the best choice among them? Senator Ping, Mayor Isko, Senator Pacquiao, if VP Lenny and Mayor Sara decide to run, could improve the country situation?
Right. Thank you very much. I thought that I want to say let's take more questions, but suddenly like wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
No, we can have a whole forum on that. Obviously, I'm going to violate some of my contracts if I endorse anyone. So I'm definitely not going to endorse anyone. I'm strictly non-partisan. So even though I'm an academic, right? I'm a non-partisan academic, if you can put it that way. But obviously, I have standards. So hindi ako boboto sa mga matay tao, sa kurakot, no? Sa tuta ng ibang bansa, whatever the country is. I don't care if it's whatever country, right? So no, I have certain standards. And for that reason, some candidates are a little bit troubling for me. But overall, I don't think this election it's about lesser evil. I'll use this as a call for action, right? Wag kayo pumunta dyan na iisipin na, oh, my one vote will change everything. No, your single vote maybe helps in a barangay elections or maybe congressional elections at best. But in the national elections, one vote cannot make that difference. But that's not the point. You go and line up there to register for hours. You go and line up there to vote for many hours. That was my experience in 2010, the first time naging millennial pa ako. The first time I became eligible to vote. Guess what? After that, I became a much more engaged, meaningfully engaged citizen. I became much more concerned with our politics. And since then, I've not been the same. I suppose in a better way. Before that, hindi ako masyadong, politics was really not my thing, even though nag-study ako sa UP Diliman. No? So my thing is that this is about commitment. This is about love, right? So don't think about, oh, one vote will not change it. Pag naghirap ka, nag-effort ka, you will be invested. You'll be emotionally invested. And when you're emotionally invested, you can be much more effective citizen. Because kung wala kang pake, that's how bad leaders win. They play into our cynicism. Or they say, lahat pare-parehas lang. Lesser evil lang at best. That's not true. Some candidates are not evil. Some candidates are actually good people. Good, decent people. Walang perfecto. Don't look for perfection, right? Don't go in thinking, we are not Norway, okay? We're not Sweden. You're not going to see the kind of candidates in Sweden that become prime minister here. Hopefully one day. But let's just be realistic. No, we're not a Scandinavian country, right? So the question here is, for our level of development and given our challenges, practically speaking, what kind of leader can we put there to a little bit nudge us in the right direction? So in short, baka hindi tayo makakuha ng Tesla. And by the way, you cannot have Tesla kung wala kang electrical charging stations. No? Yun ang problema. So minsan kahit Tesla ka, you cannot sell in the Philippines, right? The same thing happens in politics. You may be a very smart guy and everything like that. Kung wala ka naman makinarya, hindi ka naman marunong makipagpolitika, wala kang emotional appeal, no? Hindi ka charismatic, wala rin mangyari dyan. So look maybe for a Prius, no? Maybe we cannot get a Tesla as our president, but the Prius would do. Someone who may not be the most intelligent, articulate person on the planet, But kung may charisma siya, you might sense I'm already endorsing someone, but not necessarily. But I'm saying like, I'm not saying lower your standards, but I'm saying your standards, you have to have some minimum. Ayoko na mamamatay tayo. Ayoko ng treasonous person, right? Okay. Anything above that, pag-usapan natin yan. Look at the pros and cons. So don't look for 10 out of 10. It's like dating, no? Don't look for 10 out of 10. Minsan yung 10 out of 10, yung pa yung parang suspicious. Diba? Sometimes average is better, right? And when I say average, not mediocre. Like, it's good. The 7, 8, 9 could be much better, no? And we have candidates who are not 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. So there we have candidates. The Chinese, Chinese thought maybe Duterte could be like their Hun Sen, the guy in Cambodia. No? It's like, and then Philippines will sign basing agreement and all of that. I didn't have time to discuss that. But guess what? In the past 5 years, we have 0 defense agreement with China. Why? Because even if Duterte wants it, he cannot pull it off. He has to go through the Senate. He has to go through the military. And there are many other institutions in our country who have held the line, right? In fairness, you can say a lot of things about the military, right? You can try to criticize them. I'm worried about some of the red tagging situation or some of the red taggers from certain sectors. But the reality is that the Philippine military has held the line on the West Philippine Sea and South China Sea. When our civilian leaders were not doing their job, our soldiers, our brave soldiers were doing their jobs, right? So not perfect. We could have done better. Sometimes the rhetoric is contradictory, but in fairness, Secretary Lorenzana, Secretary Locsin, over and over again have emphasized the importance of our traditional alliances and holding our line, and have called out China, quote unquote, for bullying. No, this is the term Lorenzana used for China, for bullying, no, for neighboring countries and all of that. So if the Chinese couldn't get a kind of a Cambodia situation with Duterte, even if someone close to President Duterte becomes the next president, I think medyo mahirapan sila. I think they'll have a hard time pulling that off, especially now that, as I said a while ago, walang maipakita si Duterte. After all of this, I love China and all of that, anong nakuha natin sa China? 0 big-ticket infrastructure project. Ano nakuha natin sa West Philippine Sea? Gumanda ba yung sitwasyon para sa ating mga ingista? If anything, it got worse, right? More militarization. Now we even have armada of Chinese militia forces. So yung first phase was reclamation. Second phase was militarization of those islands. Third phase, ngayon, they're using militia forces. And I didn't have time to discuss this, but fourth phase by China will be to declare an air defense identification zone in the area. So our next president, whoever that person is, has to be ready for a potential emergency situation in South China Sea. Hindi kailangan na maging expert sila sa West Philippine Sea. Pero sana naman may basic conviction sila, may basic love for the country, may basic dignity sila, and hopefully they hire or they listen to some of the experts who love the country and know a thing or two about China and the West Philippine Sea. I'm cautiously optimistic that things could slightly improve or dramatically improve under the next president, even if it's not necessarily from quote unquote the opposition. No, so we have a range of candidates there who are not necessarily the most troubling, right? And as I said, I think the Duterte, the way he bungled his pivot to China will also limit the ability of his successors to also pull off a pro-China move. But let's see. Of course, the counter argument to that is that maybe Duterte was just too sloppy. If you get a much more kind of a sneaky guy or sneaky person there, maybe they can pull it off more. But I don't think so. All I can say is this: the Philippine defense establishment is determined to keep a strong alliance with America and some of our other like-minded powers. They want to improve relations. I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. Even if Duterte tried to really control the military, it didn't work out. I think it's not as bad as people think. The military asserted its institutional autonomy. But the second more important thing is yung taong bayan. No? Naalala ko, like 10 years ago, nung I was an advisor sa Philippine legislature, sa Foreign Affairs Committee, nag-work ako sa Congress, among others, like Southwest Philippine Sea, very few people knew about it. No, I used to work with also Congressman Walden Bello, and he pushed for the renaming. He passed a resolution in the Congress renaming of parts of the South China Sea into West Philippine Sea. So I was there at the very beginning. No, nung may wake-up call na tayo, no, itong Scarborough and everything like that. Now, kahit sino makita mo, may opinion na sa on clause. Forget about West Philippines, sa on clause. So yung level ng consciousness ng taong bayan, yung level ng concern ng taong bayan, ang mga ordinaryong Pilipino dito sa issue ng West Philippine Sea ay napakataas. So if you're a patriot, right, it's easier to mobilize people dahil may pakiang tao, no? And I think China sometimes has been so aggressive, and the bullying of our fishermen has been so gut-wrenching that it easily mobilizes the Filipino people whenever something crazy happens in the West Philippines. So even if you get the Chinese Manchurian candidate, which is not going to be the case in the next elections, mahirapan siya. na gawin province ng China ang Pilipinas, because the Filipino people, the Philippine Armed Forces, many other institutions will stand their ground. Not to mention on the bigger level, the Biden administration is moving hard and strong against China. And this is not a Democrat thing. This is not a Republican thing. There's bipartisan consensus that something has to be done with China. That's why you have the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal with Australia. No one saw that coming. That was crazy, right? That's why you're seeing the United States expanding its naval presence in this part of the world. That's why you're seeing the Japanese teaming up with the Germans, the French teaming up with the Indians. What do you think all of these people are doing? It's all about China. It's all about China. And if we do not want to stand our ground, it's kind of parang nakakaya na asa tayo sa iba to defend our grounds for us. Diba? Nakakaya naman sana, nakakaya yun. So sana hindi mangyari yun. So hopefully our next president understands that alliances matter. To quote Churchill, he said, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is not having allies, right? So allies are going to be questionable, no? Minsan unreliable, minsan malabo, ganun. But even worse is not having any allies at all. But I'll add something to what Churchill said. Even worse than that is having false allies. People you think could be an ally, but are actually against you. And that's why I started with the case of Aguinaldo, who allied with America, which turned out as a false ally. America betrayed us during the Battle of Manila. Sana someone reads again what happened to Aguinaldo and learns the lesson, right? So there's a reason why I brought out those cases of Aguinaldo, of Quezon, and all of this. Hindi ito pakitang gilas about history. I'm not even a historian. But as a political scientist, I saw that and said, when I was reading it, it's like, parang gusto ko i-forward ito kay Tatay sa Malacan. Ay, sir, basahin mo to. Diba? Parang ano, diba? Aguinaldo meeting the Consul General, I think, of US in Singapore. Mga sabi, interesting yan. Tapos, siya, tuwan-tuwa, yung mga Amerikano, reliable. Yung Americans probably didn't sign a thing. The Americans never signed a single document, but they made the Philippines think that they're with them. See? Sleazy. Yung ginawa nila noon 100 years ago. Now, we have a different version of that, right? So, learn that. So I'll be honest, I think the president was taken for a ride by China. Where are the investments? Where are the concessions? Walang nangyari. Sabi nila, we can do joint patrols in Panatag Shoal. Nasaan? Sabi nila, we can do maritime ecological park, whatever. Wala. You know what I'm saying? So that's gonna make it hard for a trapo pro-China guy to pull it off again, because I think Duterte was the best the Chinese got, right? As far as recalibrating our foreign policy in favor of China's interest was concerned. Again, I'm not saying President Duterte is pro-China. I don't think so. I think President Duterte has had some good intentions in terms of diversifying relations. That's why binigay ko yung lahat ng background, no? But the execution was poor. Ang dami amateur hour. And that sometimes Duterte too much personalized this. Made this more about himself, his interests, people around him. So, Bato's visa for VFA. I mean, like, even if that's not the case, that's how ridiculous it came out to much of the world. I mean, gets mo, like Banana Republic moment, yung mga ganun. Nakakaya. So, for someone like me who goes around the world and gives lecture in the Philippines, and I'll tell you, there are times I feel embarrassed even discussing these issues. And I don't want to apologize for something that is wrong, right? I mean, Singaporean said, why does your president use slavish rhetoric? So, since I use that term, that's actually from a Singaporean colleague of mine who used that term. So, pinagtatawanan tayo. So the same way that Lee Kuan Yew was making fun of Marcos and people loving the Marcoses, many people are also making fun of Duterte and people supporting Duterte despite everything. And I don't want our country to be a joke. I don't want our country to be a joke in Singapore and other places in the world. Not because I care about their opinions, because I can see their point. My point sila. This is joke time, right? This is serious stuff. Wala na yung mga jet ski jokes na yan, hopefully, no? And yeah, or take a jet ski and go. Do something about it, right? So, nonetheless, it's not the end of the world. Don't be cynical. We still have Pag-asa. We still have Second Thomas Shoal. May hawak pa tayong 8 to 9 land features sa Kalayaan, no? Para sa Second Thomas Shoal. Hindi pa tapos ang laban. Kumbaga kung boxing yan, round 4 pa lang tayo. Medyo na-knockdown tayo. Medyo mali-maling strategy. Medyo sloppy. Pero di pa tayo na-knockout. We still have a room. And my final argument is this, and I've made this clear over and over and over again. We are not here to contain China. You cannot contain China. China is too big, too powerful to center the world economy. But if we work together, we can constrain China, right? To tell China their costs, right? No one can beat China militarily, not even the Americans. But the Chinese cannot also beat the Americans militarily, no? But what we can do is to work with like-minded countries in the region, with Vietnamese, with Singaporeans, with Indonesians, with Australians, on areas where we have common interests. And the common interest here is to make sure South China Sea doesn't become a Chinese lake, right? to make sure na yung mga meron tayong hinahawak pa rin dyan sa West Philippine Sea, we still hold on to them. So hindi pa po tapos ang laban. Yes, yung Scarborough medyo nakakalungkot yung nangyari. Yung mischief reef is nakakalungkot ang nangyari. But we still have a lot to defend. We still have trillions of dollars of oil, gas, and fishery resources sa ating exclusive economic zone. Hindi lang sa South China Sea, sa Benham Rice Rin. By the way, may mga Chinese din na dumadaan dyan na mga submarines. No? So, the last thing I want people to think is like, wala tayong pag-asa, let's give up. No, this is a continuous struggle. As Justice Carpi said, this is an intergenerational struggle. And while I criticize President Duterte for not leveraging the arbitration award, andyan pa rin yung arbitration award. Hopefully the next president, Isko man yan, Sara man yan, Bongbong man yan, Lenny man yan, mukhang Lenny will run, Lacson man yan, or whoever man yan natatakbo, Kalodi, I think Kalodi from the labor union is also running. Whoever runs, God bless you. Yung leverage na yan, wag mo itapon. Because the China is not Stalinist Russia. They're not just going to invade and send tanks. Even with Taiwan, they're playing their games there. The Chinese are subtle, you know, and sometimes, yes, they can be aggressive and all, but this is not Soviet Union that will just invade Afghanistan and all, because the Chinese want to be respected. They want to be respected. They want to have authority. And basic political science will tell you that authority presupposes two things, right? Trust and respect, right? And if China is just seen as a big military bully, right? If they invade us or attack us, what do you think will happen? You think Singapore and Vietnam are going to go to China? No, they'll go to US even more. And do you think China wants that to happen? No. But do you think Duterte thinks that way? I'm not sure. So when Duterte say, wala tayong laban sa China, what the hell is he talking about? He doesn't see my chain effect yan eh. If China bullies one country, country B, C, D, and E will go to their enemy of the Chinese. That's bad for China. If China invades Taiwan, what do you think Japan will do? What do you think Korea will do? They'll even fortify their military relations with the US more, right? That's what you call balancing, right? So the idea that this is just about US and China, this is just about us and China, or just US and China misses the point. What's happening in the West Philippine Sea today concerns everyone who cares about freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, cares about rule of law, and who wants this world to be ruled by rules and regulations, no, not by bullying and military power. So if you look at my lecture, I talked about US doing its own sleazy imperial move 100 years ago. But the US of today is not that US. I mean, of course, there are many problems with US and what they did in Afghanistan. I have a lot of issues with that. But the threat today is not US. Let's just be very clear as far as our region is concerned. The threat is coming from somewhere else. But that threat doesn't mean that we have to have Cold War mentality. No, it just means we have to work together. And let me just end on this point, because I already discussed that in the previous lecture on China. No, you can look at the copy of the lecture. I believe President Xi Jinping is still a reasonable, smart guy who has a long-term vision. He's like that second Mao with more money and more smarts probably. And he realizes he cannot pick fight right and left. And my hunch is that some of these aggressive moves that China did over the past 10 years is because Xi Jinping had to build up nationalist support as he pushed China through very difficult domestic reforms. So he's using nationalist posturing abroad to gain political capital to push for reforms at home. And my argument has been proven more and more right over the years. Just look at what Xi Jinping is doing nowadays. Crackdown on Jack Ma, on fintech, on celebrities, right and left, you know, pushing for common prosperity. These are tough reforms. And last thing Xi Jinping wants to do is to look weak abroad. So he has tried to look strong abroad to push for reform. But Xi Jinping is smart too. He realizes you cannot push for effective reforms at home kung para puro ka naman away rin abroad. So that's why if you look at it in the past few months, Xi Jinping openly said China has to be more lovable. So he admitted na they need more panda diplomacy, right? Not this dragon diplomacy. So let's tap into that. Let's tap into the panda side of China and not just focus on the dragon side, right? Because there's the panda side of China that wants to be loved and respected and all of that. Because just to end on this point, I started 100 years ago, but if I started in the 14th and 15th century, we know who was the leader in this part of the world. It was China. China was the hegemonic power of East Asia. So from the Chinese point of view, they want to return to what was the case before these imperialist Western powers came in. But I always tell them, you had 100 years of humiliation. We had 500 years of humiliation, right? We don't want to go back to 14th, 15th century. We don't want to also go back to 20th century. We want a genuinely inclusive multipolar order. That's what I always tell my Chinese friends whenever I'm in China or outside, right? Yeah, believe me, they still invite me and they're okay with me. So yeah, that's what I tell them, right? But you have to hold your ground. In short, no, If you're weak, they have contempt for the weak. But if you're strong, they will give you, even if reluctantly, some degree of respect. Look at Vietnam. Look at Singapore. Look at even Taiwan sometimes, right? And other smaller countries who are holding their grounds. Or even Indonesia, Jokowi going to Natuna, right? Sending a clear signal to China, this is not a disputed area. Wala kayong pakialam dito. Umalis kayo dito. This is Indonesian waters. So just look at around the region, Jokowi, Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan, and all of that. There are many lessons to learn. So sana our leaders will be more like these leaders. They don't need to be geniuses. We're not looking for the next Nero or Churchill. We're looking for someone who's just not, sobrang malabo na sabog, diba? And hopefully, that even if medyo so lang, if that person is open to get good advice and has love for the country and patriotic, I think we can do something better. Because sometimes in your effort, in your wish to get a 10 out of 10, a kind of a magic solution, a great leader, you might end up with 0 or negative, right? And I'll just be honest, that's the story of populism. Populists promise you many things. They say many interesting things. They raise many good questions, but their solutions are horrible most of the time, right? Now, just to quickly on this, Isko Moreno, I'm not endorsing or endorsing against. Isko Moreno is a fusion. He has populist elements, but I call him a polite populist for understandable reason. But he also has very centrist ideas, and not in a bad way. He made it very clear. Pag dealing with China, he's open to service contract, so not joint development. Malaking difference on service contract means our sovereignty is still recognized. I'm not lawyering for him, but I'm just saying, hindi ganun ka bad. Forget about yung mga haters na headlines. Read naman yung sinasabi ng tao na. In fairness naman sabi ng service contract. So, I'm not sure how much Isko is aware of nitty-gritties of our constitutional law, but that actually it was correct what he said. Pag service contract, okay lang. That means our sovereignty is recognized. And if ayaw ng China, di walang mangyari, which is exactly status quo, right? Under Isko, he made it clear, we will rejoin ICC. Although, Duterte could still face accountability regardless of we join ICC or not, because the jurisdiction on mass atrocity has been already established. He made it clear franchise of ABS-CBN will be restored. So yeah, I mean, they may have similar styles and all, but for me, substance is also very important. And if you look at the substance of Isko's policy, no, I don't. I saw all these memes na si Duterte, Pilsen beer, tapos si Isko yung parang gold version. Like, I see the point, right? But I think Isko has populist style, but substantively speaking, he's more center and sometimes even center left. His ideas on socialized housing, very interesting ideas, right? And I think, as someone who came from Tondo and from the poor, he might have much more genuine populist instincts than Duterte, who comes actually from a privileged family. Let's just be very clear about that. No, so there. But this is not an endorsement because there are other candidates who also have very great, interesting ideas that I can discuss. No, but we don't have time for that, and that's not a forum for that. So, gonna invite me for a different forum on elections. Maraming salamat for those questions. Are there other questions? Maybe we can extend a bit, Sir Raul.
Yes, we can extend.
Yeah, a bit.
At least 2 questions pa.
Yes.
Yes, entertain 2 questions.
All right. Thank you, Prof. Heydarian, for that answer. I believe that Mr. McDonald Pascual is raising his hand. Sir Pascual, you are acknowledged.
Thank you, Leah. Good afternoon, Professor. Here we are again. Pasensya na, no? I cannot show my face kasi talagang medyo mahina ang internet connection dito sa amin ngayon.
Sige po.
Your presentation is getting more and more interesting actually, Professor, at mukhang kulang na naman talaga ang oras natin ngayon. Anyway, here is my question. Professor, you mentioned the intercession of Trillanes in what Enrile called as the backdoor negotiation. Can you shed light on this as to what actually happened in the negotiation? Because this is a gray area to many of us. Did that backdoor negotiation ever endanger the push for or momentum of the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Defense Department at that time? Kasi I'm wondering of his purpose of going there when our own DFA and DND were doing something at the surface.
Is there another question also? Maybe we can tie together. Baka may mga related question. Wala.
different questions.
Okay, let me
Prof.
answer this first, and then we can go. Okay, just quickly. Yes, I mean, by the way, let me just clarify. When I say post-American world, it doesn't mean that US is irrelevant, right? Actually, I didn't have time to discuss it, but US is still the largest economy. And it might still become the second largest economy, but it's still going to be one of the biggest economies in the world. Its military is still ahead of China, probably by a generation. So when I say post-American world, it just means that the US is not the sole hyperpower, hegemonic power. That it will be just it will be primus inter pares, no? But the liberal international order, freedom of navigation, free trade, so on and so forth, those values can continue because India, Australia, Japan, all of these other major powers can also accede to those values. So a post-American world will not necessarily be a China-dominated world, right? Or not necessarily an anti-US world. That's what I'm trying to say. Just clarifying that. So for me, this creates an opportunity for truly multipolar, inclusive order. But you can look at my works where I discuss, including my latest book, In the Pacific, where I discuss actually the enduring power of Americans. They may not be as dominant as before, but they're still a major force anywhere in the planet still. No, and if you look at it, U.S. big tech companies are still among the biggest. I mean, just look at the top 10 brands in the world, top 10 universities in the world. U.S. dominance is still there. So U.S. may be relatively declining because others are rising, right? Because ang poor natin dati, but everyone is rising. But absolute power of US is still formidable, right? It's just that they cannot dictate things to us the way they did 50, 60, or even 30, 20 years ago. Yun lang sinasabi ko, which is a good thing. So US may be not too strong to bully us, but it's strong enough to be helpful. That's the argument I'm making. Okay, I like that. I'll quote that somewhere else. Now, going to the question on Scarborough Shoal. Yes, I mean, there's a lot of... yan kasi problema sa atin eh. Ang daming politiko dyan and people who have vested interest to push for certain narrative. So it's very hard to come up with a kind of a consensus position on this. Maybe I have to consult people who have done more archival studies than me. The whole episode is still shrouded in mystery. Now, I asked Trillanes also about that. I think you can check it online. An interview I did when I was with GMA, FYI episodes of mine. With Trillanes, I think I raised that issue. So he gave some answers. So Trillanes has his own version. You ask Enrile. Enrile has the Enrile version, right? There's always the Enrile version of reality, right? So Enrile can give you a version of martial law, can give you a version of what happened with, and then we also talk to some of our allies and friends. They also have their own version. I mean, as I said, that's why one thing we're sure about is this. I think people like back then Assistant Secretary for this region, East Asia, was it Kurt Campbell or was it one of the? Is it Danny Russell and Kurt Campbell were one of the two guys, but so some of these officials, it seems, had second thoughts about the US getting militarily involved. They were really concerned that things could get out of control. And I think if you look at Obama was a very risk-averse president, perhaps too risk-averse. And I think that was a mistake of Obama. But Obama's thinking is this: they want to play the long game. So their idea was that Bush just attacked countries right and left and really degraded American economy and position around the world. So Obama was really in a more peace and risk avoidance mode, no? And I think that didn't work for us, but it worked for them. So that's the kind of overall situation or the coordinates of the situation. Now, so us, eto na nga, outgun and outmatched tayo with the Chinese. May standoff tayo na matagal. Surrounded yung Gregorio del Pilar natin with Chinese Coast Guard and all of that. So, for some reason, eto si Trillanes was, I think, it was still a relatively new senator back then. He suddenly becomes involved in backdoor negotiations, and I think the Philippine and Chinese business community was also behind him. So he ends up in China to do negotiations because the Chinese didn't want to talk to Del Rosario. I think that issues with Del Rosario and some of our top officials accusing them of being too pro-American. So that's why suddenly Trillanes kind of injected himself in the situation and said, okay, let me help and all. From what we understand, it was supposed to be a mutual disengagement deal. Meaning, i-withdraw natin si Del Pilar, Gregorio Del Pilar. By the way, I'm not talking about si Goyo, I'm talking about the warship. Actually, yun yung joke eh. Pag General Luna yung 2016 election, baka mag-Goyo tayo nga. But anyways, so we had to take that out, and then the Chinese had to take it. But parang nangyari dito is that because the Americans were not there to referee this, right? They were just happy that this crisis is over and they don't want to get involved. The Chinese saw that easily, and then they sent people and then just cordon off the area. And then the blame game started. So one version is that Trillanes messed up the negotiation. The other version is that Trillanes was not probably the best guy to do that very sensitive negotiation. You still had to have more senior and informed and capable and mature diplomats to do it. But it seems the problem was not with Trillanes. The problem was that was ensuring that the mutual disengagement deal was honored by China, because we honored it on our side. So this is more an issue of us being duped by China. So again, that's why I put it at strategic crossroads. No, so maybe I don't know. I mean, I'm not gonna second. We can get really deep into this, but what I'm saying here is that many wishy-washy things were happening there. Normal communication channels were not working. Our alliance with the United States was not optimal, and the Chinese sensed an opening. And we had, and the fact that Trillanes was involved in backdoor negotiation was surprising in itself. But I think to blame Trillanes for everything actually is unfair and misses the point. And it seems it's more like the Chinese, taking advantage of the asymmetry of power and American reluctance to help us. That's what happened. So that's why it didn't end up as a mutual disengagement per se. It's more like unilateral disengagement on our side, and then they continued with just dominating the area. That is why Aquino became so desperate, and he eventually had to give it the green light to the legal warfare proposal nila Albert de Rosario and some of the people inside the DFA. So yeah, it's an episode in our foreign policy na dapat balik at balikan natin. No? And I think historians will be better equipped than me to do this. But that's my understanding or preliminary understanding of this episode. It's still shrouded in mystery. What exactly went on? I covered that a little bit in my works, including in my 2015 book, Asia's New Battlefield. So it's there. But I won't pretend that I know 100% what happened. But I have an idea of the general outlines, which I discuss in my works. But yun nga, siguro dapat balikan natin, because the problem is that this episode is highly politicized. So the Duterte people, especially supporters of President Duterte, use this episode to say, see, Trillanes, wala kang moral ascendancy to say anything about Duterte. Ikaw nga and then the problem is that on the part of Trillanes, I mean, it's hard to also, will he admit any mistake if ever it happened there or not? I don't think so. I mean, his position is very clear. He tried to help. He helped the country, although I don't know why he was the senator behind it. Ang dami pa naman ng iba dyan, di ba? I mean, why him back then, di ba? Now we know Senator Trillanes because he's a veteran senator. But back then in 2012, he was, I'm not sure he was known for any credentials in foreign policy or anything. He was not even a senior senator for that matter, right? But anyways, there's more I can say, but Trillanes might run, so I don't want to say things that might come off as I'm endorsing or endorsing against a certain candidate. But that's all I can say about that episode, based on what information I have. But we have to go back to it. All I can say is clearly Americans were unreliable during the Scar-Warsaw crisis. Absolutely, that's very clear to me. Second, the Philippine Aquino administration was in shambles, right? The communication channels with China were not working. We're already affected negatively. Sabi ko nga, 2011 pa lang, ayaw na i-meet si Jintao si Aquino. Now, you can blame us, but I think the original sin is always, let's be clear, the original sin is on the other side, not on the side of the Philippines. So let's be very fair in terms of according blame, no? And of course, the Chinese, clearly they're strategically opportunistic. I mean, that's the story of South China Sea, opportunism and Chinese opportunism, right? So Americans renege on South Vietnam, China takes parasols. The Soviet kind of abandoned the Vietnamese. China has the skirmishes with them. I think Johnson South Reef, in the Spratlys. Americans withdraw from the Philippines in 1992. A few years later, the Chinese get mischief reef. I think you can see the pattern. I think it's pretty clear pattern, right? So I think this is, to be honest, for me, that's the more interesting aspect than to go into this kind of a forensic examination. This is the job of the Senate, right? Hindi ko trabaho na Senado yan, and other people who have the mandate to actually call witnesses and all. We have to really get to the bottom of this. But how can we get to the bottom of this? Either there's no interest, or a lot of our senators or people who should do their job, or people in the government are more interested in politicizing the situation than getting to the truth. And let's be honest, a lot of blue ribbon commission meet or whatever in the Senate, para more like PR stunt yan eh. Yeah. So I mean that's the problem I have. But we're getting out of the topic. But I hope that preliminary answer gives you an idea of why this episode is still very controversial, right? To say the least, to say the least. But I think the general lessons that I drew from it still stand, regardless of maybe some differences in the exact details.
Okay, well noted of that, Professor. So we have a last question from Dr. Alexander Gonzalez. His question is, you will open up with the importance of naval supremacy. With all of this maritime diplomatic humiliation, Not to mention being an archipelago and a strategic naval highway, when was the last time the Philippines attempted to improve its naval defense capabilities? And why aren't the Philippines making a significant move towards naval defense improvement? Will it be a bad move on our part to improve our defense capabilities? If not, who or what's stopping us? Sir?
Yeah, no, I mean, we have one of the biggest shipbuilding industries in the world, bro. Although I think Hanjin was involved in that and umalis na Hanjin. But we have a lot of shipbuilding civilian capabilities. Andyan naman eh. I mean, it's strange that we have to buy from Indonesia vessels and all. So I think ang kulang sa Pilipinas is an industrial policy. We have to have a clear industrial policy. And then there has to be some industrial and military complex involved in ensuring that we leverage our shipbuilding and seafaring assets to also help our own naval capabilities. Because it's one thing to buy warships and all, which is expensive and sometimes takes time. It's another thing to maintain them, and it's another thing to build your own versions, which I think we're very capable of doing. And in fairness, I think the AFP, the Philippine Navy is trying to move in that direction. I think dun sa Hanjin Yard, sa Subic na binenta, no? And as a sort of consortium took over, a part of that will also go to Philippine Navy. In fact, we need a place to even park our warships. That's a big problem. Lahat ng mga ports binibili and all of that. So ang laking problema yan. And if natuloy yung Sangli Airport project, potentially by the Chinese, that will also affect the Philippine Navy headquarters in that area, no, in terms of on so many levels. No? So I think this is not an issue of lack of capabilities or even resources. I think it's more of a question of strategic prioritization. Now, overall, regardless, I mean, yes, we could have always been a more naval oriented country, but it's like our military was already pretty strong back in the 50s, 60s, and all the way to the 70s. That's why we were able to establish an airstrip, no? Diyan sa Pagasa. We already had an advantage. Takot yung mga Malaysians and Vietnamese sa atin noon, di ba? And then because of Mindanao War and corruption and all, wala, na-degrade yung military capabilities natin. So by the time natapos na Marcos dictatorship, sobrang undermine yung capabilities natin. As I said, under Ramos, there were efforts to push with AFE modernization, but unfortunately, chronic corruption and then the Asian financial crisis in 1997-1998 also undermined our efforts. In fact, there was an effort for us to acquire F-18 Hornet fighters, pretty good fighters, no? F-18, no? Back in late 1990s, but nagkaroon ng some budget issues and corruptions and all of that, so hindi natuloy yun, no? So that's why for a long time, I think for a decade, we didn't have a fourth generation fighter, which is just amazingly embarrassing for a country, because we're not a poor country, we're a middle income country, we're close to becoming an upper middle income country. So hindi issue dito ang pera, ang issue dito is prioritization and all. But as I said, we got a kind of a third try or third attempt for reviving our capabilities since Aquino. So from 2011 until 2026, I think we have 3 horizons project of military modernization. So we're kind of moving in the right direction naman. So kung titignan mo yung naval air force capability natin ngayon compared to what we had in 2010, ang laki ng improvement natin. And I think if we can continue on the right track and allocate significant budget for acquiring, procuring new capabilities, and also for having maintenance capability, I think we can move in the right direction. Because the Americans are saying they're willing to give us F-16 fighters and advanced fighters, but we have to also have the maintenance capabilities. And we're slowly building that with some of the frigates we got from Americans and upgraded. Hopefully, we can do that also with our Air Force and all. Kaya nga, kumuha tayo ng FA-50 from Korea, because the idea was that will prepare us to be able to operate and maintain even more high-level fighters. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit geeky because I love fighter jets and all of that. We can go through that forever. But going back to that, there are engineering people there who can question me just in case. But my understanding was the FA-50 upgraded version gives us some deterrence capability kasi may weapon systems pa rin. But the idea is that should prepare you for an F-16 fighter, F-18 fighters, and hopefully, in not so distant future, 5th generation fighters. Singapore is gonna already get F-35 fighters. I mean, isn't it insane that Singapore is not even a US treaty ally, is getting 5th generation fighters already, and we're still struggling to get a 4th generation fighter from Americans. My hope is in the next 10 years, if I were the defense secretary, we get a 4.5 generation fighters, not a 4th generation, it's already too old. So let's get that upgraded versions of F-16 or F-15, no, na ang tinatawag dyan 4.5 generation fighters or Rafale fighters. I mean, for heaven's sake, di ba? 110 million tayo. Our GDP is around $400 billion. Sana naman, di ba? I mean, sana naman we at least have 1 or 2 squadron of decent advanced fighters. I mean, mas maganda pa yung fighters yata ng Myanmar sa atin eh. Di ba? I mean, isn't that like, come on. I mean, Myanmar at least I think like they have MiG or Sukhoi fighters. The Vietnamese also have like submarines, diesel submarines from Russia, and they have advanced MiG and Sukhoi fighters. Sana naman, di ba? I mean, di ba? So my point is like, sometimes we underestimate ourselves. We're not a small power. We're not a small country. For heaven's sake, top 15 tayo sa population. Top 35 tayo in terms of GDP size. You know what I'm saying? Out of almost 200 countries, we're there in the top 50 or so, depending on what key indicators you're looking at. So let's stop calling ourselves small country and underestimating ourselves. Just get our act together. And my point is that whatever you say about the Duterte years, one thing good that happened out of this, I mean, I'm not forcing a silver lining. There is indeed a silver lining. We're now seriously discussing issues of strategy. Kaya nga siguro kinuha niyo ako to do this professorial lecture, right? That's why I've been doing like 1,000 webinars right and left, no? May interest na ngayon ng tao eh. And you know, I'm glad that Secretary Lorenzana and some of these people have been listening. We are having very capable people in the government, people who are aware of our long-term interests. So in fairness, it's not as hopeless, but we need to build it up. And at the same time, also upgrade our relations with like-minded countries. India on the horizon, South Korea on the horizon, but we already have a status of forces agreement with Australia. We have to make more out of that. I completely agree with Secretary Lorenzana, and I also advocated for that. We need to revise some of the guidelines of the MDT to make it more relevant to the threats we're facing in the South China Sea, especially militia forces and gray zone. I'm for that. With Japan is emerging also as a very important defense partner. They already gave us surveillance aircraft. Secretary Lorenzana said that we may look at even more important acquisitions in the future from Japan. So Japan, for the first time in like 50, 60 years, is exporting military hardware. And now, this is not Imperial Japan of Manuel Quezon's time. Let's be very, very clear about that. The Japanese defense spending is puny compared to its economic size and compared to China, right? Like China's spending is nominally at $230-40 billion, but in purchasing power parity, it's closer to America's spending, around $500 billion. Japan is spending like $40 billion. That's pathetic. These guys have to spend much more on that and have to help other countries. So there's a lot that we can do. And just look at our neighbors, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, even Malaysia, right? They're significantly raising their capabilities. And I don't think it's an issue of money. It's an issue of strategic direction. And lastly, in fairness to President Duterte, again, I'm not trying to be suddenly nice on this note, but you know, with the Bangsamoro moving towards greater peace, right? Yung ating military hopefully will not be bogged down in insurgencies as much as before. I have no illusions that problems of terrorism and all will go away right away. Insurgency and terrorism will be here, but as we focus on West Philippine Sea and Air Force and Navy, hopefully we can also push for the peace process in Mindanao para yung resources natin pwede natin ilagay sa Air Force and Navy at hindi lahat sa Army lang. No offense to our friends in Army, but we are an archipelagic nation. Why should the Army be so dominant in our military? It doesn't make sense. It should be the Navy who should be dominant with the significant Air Force capabilities to give us the domain awareness, surveillance capacity, and intervention in contingency moments. So we have to focus on that. No? Kasi lumalapit ang China eh. Until 10 years ago, hanggang Hainan sila. Ngayon, nandyan na sila sa Subi Reef. Naku po, baka mamaya nasa Scarborough Shoal sila. Sana naman meron tayong squadron, no, to scramble and go around. Kaya naman, we don't even know what's happening in our airspace sometimes. Di ba may picture lumabas few weeks ago ng parang may fighter jets na gano'n, tapos sabi na baka alien yan. Baka hindi alien yan. Napakalaos lang siguro capabilities natin. If we had F-15, 16 fighters, we would, even alien yan, pwede natin habulin yan siguro, no? But wala eh, limited pa rin yung capability natin. So we're paying the price for decades of neglect, but we still can fix it. We can still do something about it. And I hope during presidential debates, this issue will come out. West Philippine Sea foreign policy. This was not the case in the past. But I think now foreign policy is becoming more and more important. And of course, I'm very glad about that. And of course, I look forward to having more discussions. And of course, looking forward to conversation potentially with the next president, whoever it is, right? Even if kailangan ko mag-gano, just to talk to them, if this helps the country, then so be it, right? Not to forget about, if ever lang, certain people win. But let's hope the better ones win, no? Not the Tesla, baka wala tayong Tesla, but even if Prius becomes our next president, I can work with that. I can work with that. Salamat. Thank you so much. This was really, really fun. My goodness, the more I talk, the more I realize kulang pa rin yung analysis or not. That's why nagsusulat ako, di ba? That's why I love Greeks, di ba? Not because they were really the best. They just wrote everything down, kahit yung mga propaganda nila. That's why if you go back to ancient history, we know the Greek version. We really don't know the Egyptian, Persian, other version. Because the Greeks keep on writing. So kahit yung writing nila, mga bola-bola lang from Herodotus to Thucydides, they wrote down. So let me tell you what, I'm writing everything down that I'm telling you. So hindi lang ito bola-bola, bara-bara istorya. So if ever you have more detailed question, please go there. And as much as I think I'm knowledgeable, there's just so much information I have to process. So I may not give you exactly the best answer I can give verbally. But if you look at my works, I have covered a lot of these issues. So maraming salamat and looking forward to future lectures and of course, hopefully the course also on strategic history of the Philippines, where I'll go in more detail yung first part of lecture ko today. Right? Maraming salamat. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you everyone. Thank you, Prof. Heydarian, and also for those who asked questions. And for the few unanswered questions, the technical team will send response directly to your registered email. And at this juncture, we'll award the certificate of recognition to Professor Heydarian. Allow me to read the citation. This certificate of recognition is presented to Professor Richard J. Heydarian for sharing his expertise in his lecture titled At the Crossroads, Philippines, China, and the Post-American World, which was held on September 30, 2021 from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. The said lecture was attended by the faculty members and students of the university, participants from other institutions, scholars, and other stakeholders. Given this 30th day of September 2021 with the College of Social Sciences and Development, Polytechnic University of the Philippines, City of Manila, Republic of the Philippines. Signed, Dr. Manuel M. He, University President. Sir?
All right, so to formally close this afternoon's event and to deliver his closing remarks, may I call on the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Development, Dr. Raul Roland Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you so much, Omar. No? Actually, we have many takeaways from the lecture of Professor Richard Heydarian. Of course, one of the takeaways is the importance of history, no? Its connection to geopolitics. So whenever we talk about geopolitics, definitely we should have a good knowledge of history. One good example is what was the reason why the United States decided to colonize the Philippines? So it was not an accident. This colonization of the United States was not an accident. Basically, it was very much planned. And of course, the US wanted the Philippines to be a base of, to have a base in the Asia Pacific region, and in one way or another to have control of also of China. So then later on, we talk about the so-called problem in our military, the modernization of our military. We can go back to the different treaties that we signed. For instance, after World War II, from the General Relations Act to MDT, MBA, and MAA. And for that reason, so our armed forces went into wrong direction. As mentioned by our esteemed professorial chairholder, instead of focusing so much on the development of our army, the Philippines being an archipelago, we should spend more money and time to develop our Navy and of course our Air Force. But sad to say, during the height of the Cold War, the focus of our military is to address the internal problem, internal communist aggression, and in that context, the de facto responsibility of protecting our sovereignty was given to the United States. Sad to say, after several years, we still have to change this direction and focus, of course, as mentioned by our Prof. Chair, focus on the development of our Navy and our Air Force. What else? What are the other takeaways? Again, our chairholder discuss President Marcos. I agree that Marcos had his stern foreign policy back during his term. Actually, it was Marcos who established diplomatic ties or diplomatic relation with China in 1975 and with the Eastern Communist countries in Europe in 1976. So in that context, Marcos was able to add leverage, no, against the United States. So in that context, we see how Marcos developed, or is the foreign policy of Mr. Marcos was, in a way, in my opinion, I agree with the chair, with our professorial chair, is better compared to other president. In my opinion, that's my opinion. But of course, when it comes to other point, it's another story. When it comes to human rights violation or local politics, it's another story. Our foreign relation was also affected by the different coup d'etat during the time of Mrs. Aquino. Interestingly, our shareholder said that the country was thought to be the bully by the United States in the South China Sea. Unfortunately, we are the ones being bullied at present. At this juncture, I would like to ask what can be done by the ASEAN or our country. What can the Philippines do to at least to organize or convince other ASEAN countries to help the Philippines, and maybe at the end of the day we can build a protocol in the South China Sea, especially because of the arbitral ruling in the 2016. We learned also the success of the Philippines pursuit in the South China Sea on the or the West Philippine Sea, especially that the president is the chief architect of our foreign relations. At syempre, kung titignan natin, no, hindi maialis yung kasabihan na there's no permanent ally. Pinakita yan ni Professor Heydarian, no? Na-trick tayo ng United States noong 1898 at ngayon ay na-trick tayo ng China, no? Kunyari, napakaraming programa at the end of the day, wala naman talagang malinaw na programang malaking na ibigay sa atin. So napakahalaga na pag-isipan talaga natin, no? Yung binabanggit kanina, this coming in 2022 national election is very, very significant. And we should really study our history because our president is not just a simple mayor of a town, a small town. So whatever words that will come from the mouth of the president in a way becomes a policy. At this point, I would like to thank our professorial chairholder, Professor Heydarian, for his discussion. Also, gusto kong pasalamatan. I would like to thank our university officials headed by our president, Dr. Manuel Muhi. Dr. Manuel Muhi and our executive officials always support the endeavor of our college. Salamat po sa buong pwersa ng CSST, sa ating mga faculty, sa ating mga kasamahan. No? Of course, I would like to thank also our partner from the College of Political Science and Public Administration, especially the Graduate Studies program, the Doctor of Public Administration, and the Master of Public Administration program. I also would like to thank the President of the DPA Alumni Society, Dr. Nakalimutan ko ang pangalan ni Cecil, Dr. Cecil Suerte Felipe. Thank you so much, ma'am. Before I finally end this remark, and acknowledgement, basically may tanong lang ako na gustong ibigay sa ating mga naririto. Isang tanong natin, lalo na sa mga mag-aaral natin, gamit ang inyong natutunan sa ating professorial chairholder, kung kayong magiging presidente ng Pilipinas balang araw, ano ang inyong gagawin bilang chief architect ng ating foreign policy? Para nang sa gayon, may assert natin yung ating rights. No? Not just in the West Philippine Sea, but also in other contracts, for instance. So, hindi madaling maging presidente. So, nabanggit ni Professor Heydarian na gusto niya yung kasaysayan ng Grisya. At of course, as we all know, Greece is the parang birthplace of democracy. At alam naman natin na hindi madaling maging philosopher king sa Greece. Kailangan mong maranasan yan bago ka maging philosopher king. So, yun lamang po. Magandang hapon at muli. Maraming salamat to everybody, especially to our esteemed professorial chairholder, Professor Richard Heydarian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sebastian, for the synthesis and sharing your key takeaways in the seminar. At this point, I would like to request everyone to please open your camera and wear your beautiful smile for the photo opportunity with Professor
Most
Heydarian.
important part, yeah. Maraming
Yeah,
salamat.
and
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, sir. And also, please accomplish the link of the post-evaluation